And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And, the X broadcasts are really coming full circle in part 7 here, as we'll see as we get along. We have an incredible guest tonight also, which is Dr. Joseph Farrell, who'll be along in a little bit. And I guess, it's kind of, it's important to keep in mind as we do these shows exactly what we're going for in terms of the X, that the X has showed up as this kind of steganography in my research. And there are so many parallels now with other people's research, which is what's great about when you really get into it. But I've been looking into it for a while. It's only really in the past 3 or 4 months that it's come together as something that was publicly presentable. And I have to say, everyone's been incredibly helpful also. So we really appreciate that here, because all the different things and investigations that we do are largely helped by the interaction that we have with everyone. And so it's an incredible asset to have all these bright people kind of looking at these things along with us when there's so much noise out there and there's so much Trump, Comey, and all that nonsense, and all the kind of right-wing lynch mobs and left-wing lynch mobs, and just separate all that noise and get to something we can really use, and something I think that we can all take part in and really learn from, and get to a higher stage of understanding exactly what's going on in terms of not only politics, but the larger picture here, which includes all kinds of things, including secret societies and political operations and spiritualist activities, and all the different kind of levers of power and reality and existence that we see going on. And that's really what doing the show is all about for me. But of course, tonight, along with Joseph Farrell, Olivia is here with us.
Hi, everyone.
And Olivia's been incredibly sort of helpful lately, really, tracking down some excellent stuff. So my hat's off to you. And of course, putting together everyone there in the chat is no easy job either, but you're quite the multi-purpose individual over there.
Remember, questions in caps.
Yeah, that's true, actually. Good reminder. So when we ask questions tonight, we're going to take questions for the last hour of the show, and ask them all in caps, because it makes it easy to find, because there's a lot of people in here already. It's actually a great turnout so far, and it's always very pleasing to see that, because when we go into these ideas, they are certainly, they come from the more obscure end of the pond, and they're not fast food shoot 'em up mysticism, and they're not fast food political junk. They really have this edge to them, the subjects that we go after, and I really think of it as something that we're going after together. Now, tonight in particular is particularly important, and when I say that there are breakthroughs in this show, there's some real bombshells in this show, and it'd be nice if it was just an X episode. I would do it very happily, but this one is really going to places that we haven't gone yet. Now, just a quick recap for everyone. The X steganography shows generally look into X as a symbol of unknown realities and unknown technologies being moved around through government agencies, elite families, political institutions, government agencies, and that the public aspect that we see, the actual X traveling, whether it's a particular type of rocket named X, or whether it's a program that was called X that got dropped, or whether it's a program that's funded under the name of X, the X seems to show up so consistently. And I started off with so much of the X stuff looking at time capsules, because there was this Eisenhower time capsule from 1953 that was called Project X, and it seemed very mysterious what he was leaving in there exactly. And as I went through it in this political process, after talking with the whistleblower Robert Merritt, who really, I think, went out on a limb to tell us a lot of things about his relationship with Nixon and the work that he did secretly for the Houston plan, we really got a snapshot there of Nixon's bona fides in this department that connected up all of these stories and whistleblower stories connecting Nixon to the CIA Project Blue Book, which was tracking the real UFO story and redeveloping the technology involved. And that was important, I think, because it raised us up a level, and that's a story that's kind of ongoing. But certainly at this point, since we did that on February 14th, we're in 2 months, and I think we've learned so much in 2 months just from that revelation and around the Nixon part, and that Nixon was moving towards a kind of energy disclosure and a UFO disclosure there in the 70s, which obviously caused him a great deal of problems. Now, during this process, we've also looked into LBJ and how LBJ kept a letter called Letter X at the LBJ Library to be opened 50 years after his death. Okay, so that's 2023. And when we look through this, we see that these presidents at different times, from Reagan and his activities with Gorbachev, they're holding on to some secret that they know at some point is either going to get exposed, or if it accidentally gets exposed, they want to make sure they have a role in it. And they've been rolling this information out through the 50s. And it's what I call stealth archives, because they're things that we hear about or things that we can even see. In the case of the LBJ letter, that's something that's there, that we know is actually there. It's actually listed, and we have a picture of it. But they're stealth archives because we really can't touch them. They're right out of our grasp. And so the X series aims to get at what all the secrecy is about and how the X relates to it. Now, interestingly enough, that's one aspect of it, because we're tracking a particular unknown reality or unknown technology through the 20th and 21st centuries. But when we've moved now further back and we went into some of the figures from Theosophy, like Annie Besant, and how she had a close relationship going with John Keeley, who was a kind of a Tesla-type inventor. And then we linked up John Trump, who was Trump's uncle, and going through Nikola Tesla's papers. And, we're starting to see these political mystery school technology connections that are getting us closer to what this is actually all about. And in the case of Theosophy and Anthroposophy, there were lots and lots of information coming out in the early 20th century, late 19th century, concerning Atlantean airships, just before we get flight. Now, it's pretty interesting, because if you go into the literature beforehand, you can't really find information about airships unless you go way back. If you're going back into like Greek times, there are references to these things, but it's very hard to look beyond something like Theosophy or Anthroposophy and find all these accounts of Atlantean airships. So there's something going on. There's information that's coming to the surface. And Rudolf Steiner is someone that I cite very often, who was the leader of Anthroposophy, who started off in Theosophy, and who was really the best educated of the whole group when you get right down to it. This is a serious scholar, and that's, I think, what makes the difference with his work ultimately. And what he did was he explained exactly the process of what went down, which is after the scientific materialism started to take over the mystery schools, who had held this knowledge deep, deep underground and had been traded. And we're going to speak with Dr. FARRELL about these groups when he joins us. What's so important about this is to keep in mind that these groups had to maintain these secrets. They were sworn to secrecy. They were under oaths. And many of the groups, coming from the Rosicrucian groups, the Egyptian mystery schools, and aspects of the Masons, and so on, they were doing basically, predominantly, what they thought was in the best interest, because they felt, and their lineage is, when they had let this information out earlier, things had happened like, the great Atlantean destruction, for example. When we got that level of knowledge for humanity, boom, all of our future went away. And I think that's particularly important to look at their motivations. And that's something I tried to do a little bit with this. And in this regard, Steiner makes a very interesting comment here, which helps us to understand exactly why these things were hidden and why they must come to the surface. So he's talking here about these different things, and he hints at the dark arts of the Atlantean sorcerers. And he breaks off, saying in a footnote, "For the present, it is not permitted for me to make public communications about the origin of this knowledge and these arts." And he says, "A passage from the Akasha Chronicle must therefore be omitted here." Now, this is very interesting because, of course, he's getting into these states, and he's being able to read the Akasha Chronicle, which is, the a chronicle of the skeins of space and time. Everything that's ever happened is there. It's like a library you can go and consult. And when people get to a certain level of spiritual development, this is what they can do. So people like Blavatsky, people like Steiner, Edgar Cayce have talked about being able to just go there and read this Akashic record. That's how we get so many good accounts of things like Atlantis and prehistory and events that we just wouldn't have anything to, we have no way of knowing. And the thing is, you could say, well, these guys were just making it up or whatever. But over and over again, science is yet to catch up with so many other things. And, for example, Casey's work over and over again, the Dead Sea Scrolls, whatever it would happen to be, they would be discovered after he died. The Bimini Wall, for example. So they were obviously plugging into something. And they regarded it as this Akashic Chronicle. You could go in there and read it. So Steiner is actually talking about the Atlantean powers and the Atlantean sorcerers. And he's saying, I want to get into this, but I can't. I'm actually being stopped. And I want to go to where that stops. Who's stopping it? So when he hints at these dark arts, and he says that for the present, it's not permitted to make public communications about the origin of this knowledge and these arts. That is something that we need to contemplate through this entire episode, because of course we're talking also about Skull and Bones and some of the darker groups that keep this information and their deep connections to the political situation and the money situation. So what is it that's going on here? What is it that's being moved around, and how can the X help us get to the heart of it? Interestingly enough, as we're going to discover, Plato and his whole cosmic X mystery is right at the very heart of the same thing that we're talking about, and that's over 2,000 years ago. So the X is traveling here through our history, and we're getting to know it better. And our kind of modern version of it, where they're using it to hide advanced technology and information they have relating to off-world civilizations and things like that, we suddenly get into an entirely different situation, because what we're looking at is, that's our kind of modern lens and our modern mystery way of looking at it. What's going on with these groups in the government and so on, moving the UFO file around. And that relates to the deeper, the deep state political aspects that we see so much of. But there's a larger question too, which is, how long has this thing been operating, and what is it about ultimately? And have the mystery schools been having this battle over the X before it came out into the open, and we see it, coming to the fore in the 20th and the 21st century? So, we're really in a hardcore space. We're right at a pivot point. And in this episode, the information that I have to bring forward is going to help us to understand both levels: the modern political setup of the X factor and this background mystery school, and how all that relates. And there's a link in the title back to a group called the Orphic Circle. Now, this is particularly important, and I think that there are different interpretations of the Orphic Circle, but I'm going to take ours directly through someone who was a part of it. And her name was Emma Britton, and she is a very important key for us in this episode that will kind of guide us into that particular period. So let's keep going here. So we have Steiner's warning saying, smack as I go to tell you about the Atlantean airships and some of the destruction that the Atlantean sorcerers call the Belials are the name of that group. That danger and the destruction that they caused is something that he can't get at. He's not able to talk about. So we have to wonder what that cutoff is. Is it his vows to these people? Is it something in the Akashic Chronicle he's reading? Or is it something that when you get to a certain level, you take an oath where you say, I can't reveal something that could potentially be used by someone in a hazardous fashion? So we have to kind of keep that in mind as we're moving along and just thinking, well, these are secret societies, they're up to no good. Might not necessarily be the case. There might be good secret societies and bad secret societies. We're obviously seeing a balance there. But when we get into this thing about the good ones keeping information, as we revealed with Annie Besant, taking the John Keeley information before these kind of, people trying to suppress the information. Well, what she did, you could say that she suppressed it herself, but in truth, Keeley, who developed this kind of Tesla-type coil and had an airship in 1897 that purportedly went 500 miles an hour, John Keeley when he died, his major partner there shipped it off to Annie Besant because they were already trying to kind of cause this ruckus and drive all that technology underground and say, oh, it was all a hoax and all the rest of it. And the media, even back then, of course, was participating. So we have to keep that in mind, that what she did when she gets it all is she says, oh, this is too dangerous for humanity. Let's put it aside until the time is right, until humanity can accept it, until the culture has been upgraded. And I want to keep this aspect in mind, that the mystery schools themselves may be involved in some of that, and we have to see when things are let out. So let's take a quick look at Steiner and what he has to say in relation to this aspect, because what he says is when the scientific materialism kicked in the 1840s hardcore, that humanity was adrift into this complete zone of, heading into a space scientifically where we weren't going to get anywhere. Everything was going to be about materialism, measurable results, and the entire psychic spiritualism, even religious thought and spiritual paradigms, philosophical considerations, higher understandings, and esoteric knowledge. It was all going to be blown away because everything was going to become this very perfunctory 2 + 2 = 4, and let's move along. Science is God. They've answered everything. So in response to this, according to Steiner, the mystery schools had a battle. And part of them said, no, we need to keep this secret because people still aren't at a phase where they can accept it. That is, advanced knowledge. And other groups said, no, we're really losing in this battle because what's happening is we're getting beat out. And they were looking down and scrying our future for the next 100 years. And they said, it's going to be over. There's going to be no chance. You got to let it out, risky or not. So you start seeing these movements come forward. And according to Steiner, things like the Fox sisters, things like seances, things like the spiritualism craze of the 19th century is directly related to these mystery schools, letting that information out and hoping that this other spark takes flame. And in fact, they were right, but they got very concerned with their own work after about a decade of doing this, because those people looking at it who were kind of measuring the results were saying, well, we got a big problem. We wanted to convince people there was an afterlife, but the only problem is when looking at it, they think now that the afterlife is exactly like this one. So, there's no advancement. It's basically like, hey, I'm going into my childhood home in the afterlife. And that's not really what they were shooting for. And so a lot of that kind of things that they were behind, it seems like, started to crumble. Like after a decade or two, things like the Poughkeepsie Seer or the Fox sisters, those people that were bringing this kind of spiritualism to light, didn't seem to have the same connection anymore. It's almost like they lost their source. And so I do feel like we have a kind of a window in on what was going on. And the next thing that they decide to do is let out reincarnation from a mystery school point of view into the broader culture, targeting the West in particular, which hadn't accepted it, as we know. Now, this is a very tricky thing to do in light of the situation. And again, we're talking about what Steiner has to say. Here's a shot of Steiner. Of course, Steiner, when we really look at him, I always say it's very easy to tell by looking at people, actually, the quality of who they are and their work. I don't know if a lot of you feel that way also, but there's something about the weight of the look that they give that gives you an idea of the weight of their soul and the work that's involved. And I guess that's our own intuitive sense working overtime there. But when I look at Steiner's work, my God, biodynamic farming, eurythmy, he reached into so many different areas, I think, and caused so many different changes that when he speaks on these spiritual subjects, we have to listen extra close, I believe, because especially in this time period, he spoke specifically about this time period. And I'm talking about the decade between 2016 and 2026, where he said there's a window of opportunity that opens again for what he thought was anthroposophy failing back there in 1916 when he's making the proclamation, because Germany's getting back into World War I. And he said, well, if we fail, there's going to be an opportunity there in that decade, 100 years from now. So we're in that window, apparently, according to Steiner. But let's go back to his thesis about this. So these mystery schools are looking at the situation and they're experimenting. And they let us know about the spiritual reality. They're giving us hints. They're helping us to understand, things about our occult side, our different reincarnation, spiritualism, connection with spirits, higher esoteric ideas, and these ideas that are often associated and were held in the Middle Ages, in these alchemical circles and would be prosecuted immediately. Well, they were like, we'll bring these out. And we've also seen that the churches themselves, according to Steiner, cooperated to a certain extent because they were like, look, we might get a lot of competition from these guys. It's true, but anything is better than this monster of scientific materialism. And I happen to agree with them on that because, as we can see it, as this transhumanist society evolves here and now, we're seeing exactly what they were afraid of with robot bartenders and, this kind of spiritless, soulless society where they can just teach people to be in a kind of a fear state. So they were looking at this and really realizing they were in for real problems. And there are deeper metaphysical reasons for the timing and all the rest of it. But let's cut to the chase. So at a certain point, they decide, you know what? We need to do it through an individual. And they need to establish a group that can do this. And they decide on Helena Blavatsky. And they do this because Blavatsky is unusual in this sense, which is Blavatsky can still attain to the wisdom levels the way that they could in very early eras, like that Atlantean period, where her actual astral body can rise up and take the information. And because of her past lives and all the rest of it, she was someone who they deemed was worthy in this sense. So some of them did, not all of them, but there were enough of the high mystery schools that decided to work with her. And what happened was a mixed bag, interestingly enough, because Blavatsky does establish the Theosophical Society and all of these characters rush into it. And it achieves this certain level. Now, when we get into what happens after the fact, there are battles where she tries to get into these different mystery schools, etc. So that leaves us into the situation that we're in that period. And so we've got, let's take a quick look at her. That is Helena Blavatsky. And incredibly influential individual. And again, I think it's interesting that the mystery schools and the masters, quote, associated with them are looking to women. I think that they realize that women, Besant, Blavatsky, Mary Baker Eddy, these different types of women they're looking at, they seem to be really reaching out there and thinking maybe women can pick this up. And, they're looking more to the ability for women to be able to use their psychic faculty and get on board quicker with the idea, accept the information, and move on it. So in keeping with that, there's a very interesting person that shows up on the scene to help found Theosophy. And her name is Emma Hardinge Britton. Fascinating woman. She came out of a occult group when she was a child. And in a way, you could almost say her early life was like being a MyLab because she was recruited because of her incredible psychic abilities. She was somnambulist. She would go into these trances. She would, she kind of did these Casey trances where all this information would pour through her. And interestingly enough, early on, she had a very successful career as an actress and an opera singer, dancer. Take a good look at her. Absolutely incredible past. And Blavatsky was noted for saying about Emma Britton that she had never seen a more clairvoyant trance channel. And that's pretty interesting because she had a tendency to be very hard-nosed about anybody. But she made the comment saying, if I could combine her psychic ability with Annie Besant's incredible courage and intellect, then we'd have this kind of super being who could be the leader of Theosophy for the next century. But Emma is very fascinating in what I want to say about her life is this, that she grew up under unusual circumstances that are in her bio. And I'm going to read a little bit about them because it'll give us an idea of exactly what was going on here. So she's famous for a book called Ghostland, by the way, and she's one of the most famous spiritualists of the 19th century, although she's kind of shunted down a little bit now for some reason. I don't know. It's, you know, people have just kind of missed the boat on her. But in the book Ghostland, she talks a little bit about how she got into this early on. And this is where we get into this Orphic circle controlling her life early on. Once they find her and discover that she has these abilities, they start to use her. And so she says, when quite young, this is from Ghostland, when quite young, in fact, before I became acquainted with certain parties who sought me out and professed a desire to observe the somnambulist tendencies for which I was then remarkable, I found my new associates to be ladies and gentlemen, mostly persons of noble rank. And during a period of several years, I and many other young persons assisted at their sessions in the quality of somnambulists or mesmeric subjects. And this is very important because Mesmer, of course, was this incredible doctor from a century earlier who was realized this whole thing about animal magnetism and the incredible healing properties that it have, but this energy person to person, and it had this whole psychic aspect as well. So, you know, when we hear someone wants to mesmerize somebody, or the, you know, hypnosis really comes from this. It's from putting these people into a state, into a trance. But he could also, he created, you know, he didn't create it, but you could say he rediscovered magnetism, and they could magnetize water or magnetize an object. And a lot of it was really used for healing predominantly. And we'll do a show on Mesmer specifically because it's so important. And again, I think it's so left behind there. But what's important here is that she's saying that they're using these kids, these psychically gifted children, of which she was one. And here she starts with them at 11 years old. They're using them as a mesmerist subject. So they're kind of getting them into these trances, and they're, you know, putting them into this kind of sleepwalking trance where they can ask them, a la Casey. And they are really, you know, the aristocracy of the period. This is in London. And, you know, we're looking at somewhere around the 1830s. Now, I'm going to go on with what Emma has to say about this because it is quite fascinating. And this is where we get an idea of these groups that are working. So the Orphic circle is very important, is going to link right into the heart of our X trajectory. So I want everyone to really take note of that name, Orphic circle. And I'm also going to tell you that the name Orphic circle has been caricatured in everything from games to people talking about occult societies like the Golden Dawn. This might not be as simple as just pulling out what people have called the Orphic circle, as we'll find out. Okay, so we'll go on with Emma. It was one of their leading regulations never to permit the existence of the society to be known or the members thereof named, at least until they passed from earth to the higher life. It is virtue of this clause that I am at liberty to say that Lord Lytton, Bulwer Lytton that is, the Earl of Stanhope, and Lieutenant Morrison, better known as Zadkiel, the author of Art Magic, belonged to the society. And she did, in fact, tell us a few of the people who were involved. Now, we need to stop at Bulwer Lytton for a minute, because Bulwer Lytton did a series of books, including The Coming Race, which dealt with Rosicrucian themes about this Vril society that lived underground and had amazing technology. He's got the airships in there. He's like the early sci-fi writer. But he's also, you know, a British politician and somebody who's very high ranking in society. So it's an unusual thing, like the ideas that are pouring through him. But when you read that stuff, it's incredibly advanced. And I would say easily that the science fiction writers of the 20th century borrowed very heavily. And even now, you see people borrowing very heavily from this tradition. Now, each one of these people is fascinating enough to spend a lot of time on, for sure. But for now, I'm going to say in regards to Bulwer Lytton, the airships, the Vril, again, he's talking about unusual technology. I was reading his Alice X book, actually, last night, and there's this whole theme that we have flowing through these different studies. And I think The Coming Race is a particularly good book of his. But we can see easily, and people have picked out the Rosicrucian themes, one. So we've got the mystery school of the Rosicrucians, who we've gone into in a previous episode. In short, from medieval times, they carried forward this tradition that went all the way back to the mystery schools of Egypt and through the Christian period. And we have this kind of Christian Rosenkreutz character coming forward, and all these people pamphleting and creating this craze for Rosicrucianism in the Middle Ages. Well, we're looking at about the late 16th century with that. And all of the major figures around the occult groups and the esoteric leadership that we know about, like Steiner and Blavatsky and all the rest of it, they all understand how important the Rosicrucians were. And later, we'll find people like Walt Disney are members of the Rosicrucian Society in America. So, this is something that really, Gene Roddenberry, for example. But suffice to say on that, we really are looking at this combination of technology with a mystery school. So Bulwer-Lytton, again, when she identifies him being part of this group, then we know what we're talking about. So she identifies the group, and here's what she has to say in relation to the name, the Orphic Circle. And it's very interesting language that she uses, because remember, she's used as a child for years. And what she describes here in her autobiography, which I recommend, is being involved with this group and them leading her through these trances and these things, these apparitions occurring. And what they're looking for on one level, these aristocrats, noblemen, and, successful authors and all the rest of it that are in this group that's highly secret, is they're looking for information, one, that pertains to the nature of reality. So they're looking for spiritual breakthroughs. They're kind of creating their own mystery school using these techniques. Where they got the techniques in the first place is going to become very important. So we're bringing this whole thing forward. And at the same time, they also want to obtain state secrets. So she's identified herself highly clairvoyant, able to go into trance, and they can ask her questions. Basically, she can obtain that information. She can read the Akasha Chronicle. She can do these different things. So they're using her very young, but there are other people that are her age, and she identifies them as girls. So they're using these young women for psychic purposes, using them as channels, bringing that information forward. Now, we know there have been so many esoteric circles and psychic circles that we hear so much about, like Maria Ortzik and the Tula Society and all this. And those things are real, and they did happen. But apparently there was some understanding in these groups that, they could get these very psychic children and use them for these experiments of raising them to a point where they were giving these trance readings. And, very often, like in this group, she works with them till she's about 13. Now, I think the only reason that they stopped working with her is because the phenomena that she was generating became very hard to control. And also her father passed away, and that may have been some of the secrecy that he actually set her up with this group, because the mother didn't seem to know anything about it. Emma is absolutely fascinating, and the information breakthrough that she gives us speaking about the Orphic Circle is important. So here's what she says. The Society of Occultists, to whom I can now only allude, and who are named in Ghostland as the Orphic Circle, obtained knowledge by means I am not at liberty to mention of those persons whose associations they desired. So, for example, if they were looking at a political situation, for example, they had a method, a psychic method for putting these gifted children into these states where they could read that information. What was it that Steiner said earlier? He said, I'd like to go further and tell you about what the Atlanteans were up to, but I'm cut off. Well, here also, Emma is telling us the society of occultists I can only now allude to and who are named in Ghostland, her book, as the Orphic Circle, obtained knowledge by means I'm not at liberty to mention. There's some wall there, which is once you become involved with them, even if you're coming out and sharing it with the public, the way that Emma Hardinge Britton was doing and the way that Rudolf Steiner was doing, there's still that wall that you can't cross, because when you do that work, there's some kind of a pledge involved. And, but she's giving us her best thing. Now, one thing I want to point out, which is that she says, the Society of Occultists to whom I can now only allude and who are named in Ghostland as the Orphic Circle. She doesn't say that their name is the Orphic Circle. She says that in her book, she named them that. I found that very interesting. But I feel that, by the way, the name Hardinge, which is a surname that she used her entire life, even when she got married, came through her work with this occult society. And people like Bulwer Lytton were very close to people like Dickens. And oddly enough, her father was named Ebenezer. So I really found that very interesting. So if we follow Emma just a little bit, she will, from there, this is a very almost like Illuminati lifestyle, because as a child, she's kept from other kids and they develop her as a psychic and they have her do all this stuff, but they don't tell her really what's going on. But during some of the trances that they put her into, beings appeared and, poltergeist activity was observed. And so it got out of hand at a certain point. So what they do is they put her in a kind of traveling situation. Her father dies, and she's hooked up with this traveling, theater company, and they go to Paris with her mother and stuff. But her abilities are so off the charts that when she's playing piano and things like that, she can do whole concertos, and, she's absolutely inspired. And Emma will go through these incredible experiences, and it really looks like there's a guiding hand, watching, keeping an eye on her psychic development. She eventually winds up going to New York, and the newspaper that she's familiar with in London while she's there says, if you want to, you can write these articles for us about the American spiritualism movement. Now, what's fascinating is it's a few years later, and even though she's been in these occult groups, her mind is kind of wiped clean. Which is why I say this story is very much like a MyLab story, or, a typical kind of MK Ultra style story where they've kept her in the state of mind. But by the time she gets to New York, she's actually cynical about spiritual things and spiritualism. And this is Emma Hardinge Britton that we're talking about, who's a very important early spiritualist who, she wound up giving readings for Abraham Lincoln. And actually, when he died, she gave this impassioned political speech. They sent her on tours across America during his election, going out and saying, get the vote out type thing. She was a very inspirational speaker, I guess, because she was an actress in addition. But she was very kind of fascinating figure to hit America at that point. And so when she comes in and she's observing these seances and things that are going on in like 1840s America, she's very cynical about it all. And she's lost that kind of connection with that whole world that she had when she was part of the Orphic Circle, although she discovers it later. And one of the things that happens is she gets into a seance room, and the medium who's conducting the seance is a young, like a 16-year-old girl who has this incredible psychic ability again. And the girl says to her, you are basically the best medium I've ever met. And all these strange things pass, where she tells her a message from her father who passed away. And it's a very dramatic scene. And what happens is basically Emma's ability is known in New York, and she just becomes the most important medium psychic in this whole period of time. And in a few years, a decade or two down the road, Blavatsky will show up and she will form the Theosophical Society with Emma, and Emma will split away from her, as we see this in the mystery schools very often. And because she thinks it's going into Eastern a direction. But the thing that Emma is giving us really is that she's telling us that this Orphic Circle was developing these children for incredible psychic work, psychic espionage, but also exploring the relationship of man and the universe and things along this line. So we're getting an opening here when we're looking at these people like Bulwer Lytton, who's a part of this society, using somebody like Emma to get this information. So what is it that they're after? Well, interestingly enough, there's a couple of big clues in there, which is the mesmerism is one. And just previous to this period is this whole Swedenborgian movement that happens. And Emanuel Swedenborg is this incredible figure who at a certain point, is this incredibly well-respected figure in Sweden. And he moves in the society these ideas of wild spiritualism. That is, he is going into spiritual worlds and conversing directly with Christ. He is going to other planets. He's doing all these things. But he's an incredibly learned man. This is not some, his books were inspirational on people like Jung and all the rest of it. And I remember spending many teenage days and hours in something they call the Swedenborg Library here in Boston, because it's an incredible reading room on Newbury Street. And you would just go in there and it was shelf after shelf after shelf of Emanuel Swedenborg. And the work was so powerful. And it's another one of these waves, like the Rosicrucian wave, which I think Steiner is alluding to, where the mystery schools decide we're going to let out more and more. But so again, Swedenborg, somebody we can do a whole show on, but we're getting the idea through these different various people. Now, let's connect that and plug it in all with the American political scene that we all know and love, that we've been doing the shows on here in relation to it. But before we do, how are we doing over there?
Excellent.
Okay, Olivia. And for anyone who's just tuning in, this is Dark Journalists, and we have Dr. Joseph Farrell joining us shortly. We're talking about X. This is part 7 of our series on the X steganography, and we're dealing with the Orphic Circle, Skull and Bones, and Plato's Cosmic Mystery X, which when we get to it is going to be a mind blower. But we dealt with Emma Harding because we were coming out of Theosophy in the last episode, and Emma tells us about this Orphic Circle, and we're starting to understand these occultists working in London and trying to shape the political scene, one, but also deal with this larger question of the mysteries. And we went into Swedenborg briefly there. Now, Swedenborg calls all these ripples in all these different religious circles and political circles. People don't know what to make exactly of him. Just like Mesmer, we have these upstarts. And what happens is history kind of knocks them down and keeps them afloat. Even Mesmer is sort of thought of as, if you talk to somebody in serious circles about Mesmer, they think it's this kind of joke of people holding sticks in water and stuff. It's incredibly advanced. But let's take a look at this fellow who picked up on Swedenborgianism. His name is George Bush. And he is the great-granduncle of George Herbert Walker Bush. And I think I see Joseph down there.
Howdy.
There he is, Joseph. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you. Good to be here.
This little section, you came in at the perfect time, because you're going to particularly like this one because you understand the Bushes probably better than anyone.
I don't want to understand the Bushes. I really don't. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, it's good to see you, G.
Good to see you too.
And everyone, if you're just joining us, we're with Dr. Joseph Farrell, and it's Dark Journalist. Go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter, by the way, for shows that are coming up relating to this X. Because that's my best way to stay in touch with you, because people don't always get the YouTube notifications, of course. In the second half, we're going to be taking questions also. So ask them now, all in caps, and Olivia will jot them down. And Olivia, say hello to Joseph.
Hi, Joseph.
Hello, Olivia.
It's great to have everyone here. And
Except
I
the
was
bushes.
just I was just showing a picture of Joseph's favorite family here. Here's the real kind of
I don't
patriarch
know. I
there.
don't know who that is.
It's pretty interesting. He is George Bush.
Oh,
And
is that the
it is.
patriarch?
Yes. And what's interesting about this, it's fascinating because I've gone very deep in the literature, and I think that this is a bombshell. I've never heard of this George Bush, but he absolutely exists, and he's listed in the Bush family history. And he's been confirmed by different things the family has done, but they've kept him way on the back burner because he was this major, raging Swedenborgian mesmerist.
Oh, gee.
So you know where we're going tonight.
Yes. I'm along for the ride, folks. I don't know where we're going.
See, this is the thing. I do this to Joseph, but he, before it's over, he's going to shock us all. Joseph, interestingly enough, I'm going to show you George Bush's first book in America. And it's the first book dealing with this in America. It is called The Life of Muhammad.
Pull it up a bit. I can't see the religion of Islam and of the Empire of the Saracens. Interesting.
Yes, 1830. And George Bush is a Presbyterian minister before he gets into the Swedenborg stuff. And he writes this incredible book dealing with Muhammad and Islam and all the rest of it. And he's the first American to write about Muhammad.
Really?
Interesting person to have back there.
You mean first person to write a book?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Gotcha.
And there are, these kind of religious circles that he's in. He's very hardcore into the development of these kind of religious circles that are coming up at the time. Everything was springing up then. I mean, Mormonism and all the rest of it. So, but this is what the American Jewish Archives have to say about him. And I'm just going to read a couple of things about him, and then we're going to blast right into the Bushes. In later years, both Dartmouth and New York University, where he was a professor for many years, seemed to have been embarrassed by Bush's association with them. The college histories refer to him as a promising academician who was led astray by his unconventional beliefs. The Dartmouth alumni records note his conversion to Swedenborgianism and his adoption of the modern myth of spiritualism. These changes were much lamented owing to his high character and distinguished scholarship. One wonders whether Bush would have been surprised by the realization of the dream of the return to Zion, then advocated only by a small group of Christian Zionists and led by Bush. 1830. Pretty early on.
Nothing suspicious there.
Well, of course, when I was reading your book and you found this incredible bombshell relating to Zionism and somebody making this kind of projection in 1912 about all the events that were to come there in 1945.
Yeah, that was Max Nordau, who was one of the. I'm getting a little feedback. That was Max Nordau, one of the early Zionist leaders, who mentioned that at the 11th Zionist Congress in the year 1910, mentioned that there was a plan on the part of the great powers of Europe to literally commit a genocide. And it's in that little phrase, in that little passage, that the number of 6 million is mentioned for the first time, that this was a plan in place. Now, that quotation actually does exist, although it exists in different forms. But it was apparently said by one of the Zionist leaders in the year 1910. That's 4 years before World War I.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's incredible. What I found and what I was trying to link up with Bush, and I think you'll find this interesting, which is he goes in his research hardcore into this idea of, oh, by the way, there's Herbert Walker there with Skull and Bones.
Oh, what a lovely group of people.
Just so we know who we're talking about here and why. Here, of course.
Chapter 322, yep.
Yes. The 322 bothered me, and I spent a little time with it. And interestingly enough, one, there's a whole Skull and Bones prophecy in Ezekiel relating to the founding of Israel again after everything, sort of like the rebirth. So this is, kind of a cornerstone of the Zionist approach that came out. And so he refers to this. Bush does a whole book on it, and it's what he's most known for, actually. This George Bush from the 1830s. And he has a little book that he puts out regularly. It's like a quarterly magazine that tracks these things, and it's called The Hierophant. So we get Now, interestingly enough, there's a rumor that they got into the 322, and it was relating to some random thing in history about taxation in 322 BC. But I didn't like that too much, but I did find something very interesting, which is there's a whole incident about a hierophant in 322 BC in Greece. And it's a hierophant that takes part in this whole revolt, and he claims all this power. And what ends up happening is Aristotle basically takes a fall based on his efforts. And I thought it was interesting when I was putting this together about the early roots of Skull and Bones that this Bush has this incredible Skull and Bones lecture about the founding of Israel again. He's an early Zionist. And then he's got this 322 BC thing in his past because they found this kind of random 322 BC in a safe for the Skull and Bones. So not to make it too convoluted, but this Hierophant quarterly thing being associated with Bush and what he was doing in 1830, putting this out. And then this 322 BC Hierophant taking out Aristotle started to make me think a little bit about what that society, Skull and Bones, was really set up for. As we know, all the Bushes, Prescott, George, and George W., all came through Skull and Bones, as did most of the Brown Brothers Harriman clan, and also Jesus James Angleton. I mean, just an incredible roster there.
Yep.
But just to round out two things about Bush, so we can get right into this. This is his book on mesmerism and Swedenborg, so that we know who it is that we're talking about. And interesting, a colleague of his said that he was working feverishly on this book about Friederike Hoff, who was this incredible German clairvoyant who went into these trance states a la Casey and gave all this incredible information, and that this was his big thing, but I don't find that book anywhere, interestingly enough. So the esoteric stages behind these political movers, and what we're looking at is these political movers getting into a position where within 100 years they're able to basically shape the entire world. And I'm kind of looking here for their roots in the mystery schools, Joseph, which is why I called out the big guns.
So you're asking me what?
I'm relating, of course, we've been doing the X series,
Right,
going in very deep with it. But when I'm finding this Bush setup around Skull and Bones, and I'm finding the Bush mesmerism, and I'm thinking about the mystery schools pushing the information out in this period as a balance, basically, against the scientific materialism of the period. And then you were kind of seeing groups from the other end of that spectrum, like kind of the black arts versions. So maybe the good mystery schools would be putting out things like theosophy or anthroposophy, and that's kind of the light end of bringing that information forward. But over here, we have these other mystery schools, and they will result in things like Nazism.
Let's do some dot connecting.
Yes.
Okay. Let's go back to Adam Weishaupt. I'm getting feedback. Let's go back to Adam Weishaupt and the Bavarian Illuminati, founded in 1776, May 1st, 1776. If you look at who Weishaupt recruits into his organization, it eventually becomes quite extensive. He's recruited clergy, Protestant and Roman Catholic. He's recruited various dukes, princes, and so on. He's penetrated the Grand Orient lodges inside of France. There are direct connections between the Bavarian Illuminati and the Jacobins. You can find Illuminist doctrines in Robespierre, the whole reign of terror, set up the goddess of reason, the whole thing. You can also find proto-communist doctrines in Bavarian Illuminism. This idea of a return to a society. Weishaupt brags or boasts that he wants to establish a society where there is no more rule of princes or priests. In other words, he wants to go back to, in his own thinking, to a pre-patriarchal age in which there are no class distinctions. He's an anarchist, essentially. Mm-hmm. This is why his movement is so carefully tied, if you trace the threads and connections, is tied to the 1848 revolution and so on. Now, here's the interesting thing. Weishaupt sets this up. In turn, when the order is suppressed by the Bavarian government, where does Weishaupt go? Well, he goes to Frankfurt. And of course, this is a dot that I have found no evidence for, but I have strongly suspected. Mm-hmm. Because you do not have any records of the finances of the Bavarian Illuminati, which were quite extensive. I mean, this was a group that was fostering covert operations all over Europe, all in the name of promoting the revolution. And if you look carefully, I strongly suspect, given some of the people that he has recruited into the Bavarian Illuminati prior to its suppression in 1786 by the Bavarian government. If you look carefully at some of the people that he's recruited, guess who else's circle they run in? They run in the Rothschilds circles. And of course, where are the Rothschilds from? They're from Frankfurt.
Right.
Okay. So I strongly suspect that this is where you begin to see this use of, as you're calling it, mystery schools. I'm going to call it the crypto-Zionism of Freemasonry. Because if you look at Masonic doctrine, this is kind of an undertow that you find throughout Masonry, particularly in the higher ranks of Masonry, the Scottish Rite. You find all sorts of Hebrew references in the ranks in the Scottish Rite. You find the same thing in the York ranks. So I suspect that what's really going on here, in part, is on the one hand, you have a kind of a secret society culture war going on in Western Europe to, in their thinking, press the last degree of the Enlightenment and get rid of the last remains of Christian civilization in Western Europe. And at the same time, they're trying to set up this pre-patriarchal, classless society. And of course, they're looking towards some sort of Zionism to do this. Mm-hmm. By the time this gets translated across the pond, what you see emerging from these circles, and I'm so glad you pointed out Bush, this Bush family member, because I never knew about this guy nor what he was up to.
Mm-hmm.
But it makes a lot of sense because it's at that time in American history that you see the rise of the so-called rapture doctrine, the dispensationalist theology that says, oh, well, the church is going to be eliminated at some point, and then everything's going to return to Israel, and we're going to start wringing the necks of turtle doves and sacrificing animals in the temple at Jerusalem again. Which I have to warn people, this is not historical Christian doctrine at all. It's not even remotely close to it. But anyway, it's there. And what's really interesting is you can go back to the Middle Ages. There is a fellow by the name of Joachim of Fiore. I'll spell that in the chat room for everybody.
Okay.
Joachim of Fiore. There we go.
Yes.
Okay. Joachim of Fiore is kind of a 13th century Franciscan proto-dispensationalist Zionist guy. Okay. In other words, he's one of the first people that comes up with all these Bible charts of the ages, and you can predict when certain things are going to happen. Well, interestingly enough, in Fiore's teaching, you have this idea of a final spiritual church where, again, all of these class distinctions, clergy and laity, princes and serfs, all of that is abolished. So in other words, it's coming out of a deep impulse in the Middle Ages, this whole idea. And it wends its way through the Illuminati. It wends its way through the secret societies in Western Europe in the 18th century. It picks up this kind of proto-Zionist doctrine in the Americas with this dispensationalist theology, which I point out was promoted by a bunch of oil men and bankers. So there you go, folks. Those are my extra dots here.
Wow, that is fascinating. Well, I think it's interesting when we get into this period. Everywhere I turn, I'm seeing New Atlantis, New Jerusalem.
Yes.
And Atlantis is this hardcore smack in the middle. It's almost like, okay, the mystery schools are ready to talk about Atlantis now.
Right.
And if you go back, if you're looking before the 15th century, 16th century, it's pretty scant. But once you get 17th, 18th century, even Ignatius Donnelly, who's running.
Once you get to Francis Bacon.
Yes.
And his work, The New Atlantis, to me, it's very clear that what he's really talking about is the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's no accident to me that the founding fathers, everybody says, oh, well, these were Christian people. They set up a Christian nation. Well, no, they were Anglican deists. And for the most part, they were Freemasons.
Mm-hmm.
And their thinking is coming as much from that impulse as it is from the other impulse. And I think that they're playing the game of running a grand experiment on this continent. It's absolutely crystal clear to me. And the reason it's crystal clear to me is you can look at the reaction of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and some of the other founding fathers when the Bavarian Illuminati are exposed and suppressed, and they're horrified. And the first thing Washington wants to know when he's writing all of his nervous letters about this is, are they over here?
That's right.
Have we been had?
All right, right.
That's basically reading between the lines.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, that's always struck me as his reaction, what have we done,
And it's true, because a lot of people will say, well, the Illuminati is mythological or whatever, but there it is right in Washington's handwriting. And all those guys of that period, there are different references that come up. It's absolutely a fact that it was a group. There's no doubt that, that there's just no doubt about it. And I think to try to spin the tale and say, well, it was just a myth or whatever, because people have exaggerated it at times, is a good way to try to get rid of it.
Well, look at I don't know if you've ever been to the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., but if you go to the Jefferson Memorial, you stand inside, and on the wall are all of these oaths that Jefferson took. I've sworn an oath on the eternal altar of God to fight tyranny, blah, blah, blah. And, everybody, most Americans think, oh, what a fine Christian man. No, what Jefferson's talking about is his oaths that he swore when he was inducted into the Masonic lodges in France.
Right. Yeah.
That's what he's talking about. So,
right.
6 of one, half dozen of the other here, folks.
Right. It is fascinating when you think of it that way. And there's no doubt that when we get into the Masons, we're looking at levels of understanding. That is this kind of superficial level of the Masons, and then that deep level, which really has that mystery school connection, and that goes back centuries.
Well, it's important for people to remember that when Weishaupt set up the Bavarian Illuminati, what he did was he intentionally took the Masonic lodges as his recruiting post. In other words, he penetrated the Masonic lodges and used them as a recruitment vehicle for his special version of Masonry. So in other words, you have a secret society within a secret society. And in Weishaupt's case, you had a secret society that was absolutely proven to be dedicated to revolutionary activity. We'd call it terrorism now.
Right.
And the other thing we need to remember, particularly by the time of Weishaupt, is that Masonry began to be spread not only throughout Europe, but in the Ottoman Empire, throughout Egypt, in Russia, and so on and so forth. So it was all over.
Wow. That's absolutely fascinating, because when we go back and we're looking at that, we can see that there's this tremendous influence, and you can't always see where it's coming from.
Right.
This is what I've noticed. And when we look at these periods of time, which is also fascinating, is we get into, airships.
Yep, we certainly do.
So I was just teasing around here looking. I have a picture of Swedenborg. He's got a picture of an airship. Oh, here it is. And this is his airship. Straight up and authenticated and all the rest of it. We've got, all these different kind of esoteric schools talking about it. Suddenly, everyone can talk about airships. Rudolf Steiner's school talks about it. The Theosophists talk about it. Scott Elliott writes a whole book about what they do. What is this? This is before, of course, we get into the Wright brothers and real flight and all the rest of it. But airship, whenever we get around the Atlantean thing, suddenly it's okay to talk about this stuff.
You know what else you have being talked about in code amongst certain Masonic lodges?
What?
About 2 decades before Marconi, you have them talking about devices that they use to communicate instantaneously with other lodges around the world.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. There's clearly something going on, and to me, I think the airship radio part of this story is deeply connected to these Masonic groups, because if you look at some of the early charges of Freemasonry, I'm thinking particularly of the old Scottish charges from the late 16th century, beginning with the early 17th century, they make it very clear that one of the things that the Mason is to dedicate himself to is to the recovery of the ancient knowledge and the ancient science. So in other words, it's part and parcel of Masonic doctrine that there is a lost technology, and that somehow this technology can be recovered through the careful attention to the rituals and doctrine of Masonry. Washington himself, in his oath that he took as a Mason, and he writes about this, he says that the goal of the Mason is to turn the stream and to recover this ancient high wisdom. So it's not surprising to me at all that you have this Atlantean airship thing happening in the early Enlightenment, because it's in the early Enlightenment that these mystery schools, the Rosicrucians, the Masons, and so on, kind of come out into the open and begin, active open recruitment. It's not accidental.
Somebody's told them it's okay.
Yeah. You've got the green light. Now, as to why that is at that time, I honestly don't know. I suspect part of it is because you had a number of very bright intellectuals in Western Europe, and I'm thinking of three. I'm thinking of Isaac Newton, René Descartes, and Gottfried Leibniz. Okay. Now you can't do modern mathematics. You can't think modern mathematics without those three men. And all three of them, this is what I find so very interesting. I even wrote this with Dr. DeHart in a little book that we published called Talk Radio for the Eyes. All three men stated that when they looked at the ancient geometers, the ancient mathematicians, Euclid, Iamblichus, Pythagoras, and so on and so forth, that they were convinced, all three men now, they were convinced that the ancients had a system of mathematical analysis that had been lost or suppressed. And in fact, Newton and Leibniz both thought that this is something that had been suppressed. In other words, there was a super sophisticated mathematical technique of analysis that had been deliberately suppressed. Wow. And they were convinced of this simply from reading some of these people. So yeah, I think you had a kind of, with the early Enlightenment in the 16th century, and then of course continuing on with the Enlightenment in the 18th century, you had an impetus that was culturally at that time in Europe too big to put back in the bottle. The Renaissance had unleashed Hermeticism. You have these three scientists talking about ancient techniques of mathematical analysis. It's too big, and in that context, I think the cultural ferment's there to start talking about airships, Atlantis, and taking these things seriously. That to me is huge. Here we are in the middle of the Enlightenment, and we're supposedly launching the scientific era, and we're in the middle of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And what are we talking about? We're talking about Atlantis.
Right.
And ancient secret societies and ancient technologies and so on and so forth. So in other words, I'm not the one inventing this. It's these guys.
It's a legacy. Yeah.
It's a legacy. Exactly.
Wow. That is fascinating. Well, the fact that when you connect those dots, because such high profile figures coming forward and saying that.
Right.
I do think it's interesting. I started the show off speaking about this woman, Emma Britton, who was one of the people who set up Theosophy and broke away because she thought it got too Eastern. And Blavatsky said she was the best trance medium that she'd ever met. And she was an American, she was from London, came to America, but early on, when she was between 11 and 13, through some connection with her father, she had a very unusual association with this occult group that she called the Orphic Circle. And they used her as this kind of somnambulist trance channel. And she did everything from getting state secrets from them to, the universe, whatever it was, and she forgot so much of it, but she remembers the incredible kind of poltergeist that happened when they did these things. But she said that the leader of the society was Bulwer Lytton. And she said
that.
Yes. And the groups of people that would come and do this with her were noblemen, were the aristocracy in London, and they used her for this. But I find it very interesting. I was reading The Coming Race by Bulwer Lytton, and I'm picking up Rosicrucianism, Vril, underground societies, airships. I mean, they are letting it out.
Yes.
Directly through this figure.
Yes. Yeah, they're letting out not only, especially in Bulwer Lytton's case, they're letting out not only the idea of airships and things like this, but they're letting out the idea of a physics that's behind it. And to me, it's very interesting. Oh, I've got somebody sharing their music with me. You hear this boom in the background. Anyway,
it's a dance floor beat. It's kind of...
Yeah, well, they're about ready to get some Bach here, but Bulwer Lytton is interesting to me because he's the first one that I'm aware of that popularizes the idea of, the vril, the ether, this all-pervasive energy that is behind not only physical forces and phenomena, but consciousness and conscious effects and spiritualism and things like this. And that, again, to me is very interesting because this is the doctrine that you actually find in ancient Egypt. You find it in the Hermetica. You find it even in Plato. You find it even in Aristotle. So they're reviving this doctrine. And again, to me, it's very interesting that you have, especially Leibniz, one of my heroes, thinking that they had this technique of mathematical analysis that had been deliberately suppressed. Well, he attempts to recreate it. Leibniz is Leibniz. He's not going to just talk about it. He's going to try and recreate it.
Right.
But they make a number of astonishing discoveries and assertions and start popularizing this stuff. And it mushrooms. I mean, it becomes this growth and momentum all of its own. So that by the time of the First World War, Europe is just awash in all of these secret societies and all of these mysteries, and everybody's pamphleteering and pushing all of this stuff.
Wow. Yeah.
It's astonishing to me. And here's the thing, Daniel. I'm going to crawl way out onto the end of the twig here. I do not think, in all honesty, that you could have had the invention of quantum mechanics if you had not had that earlier philosophical preparation for it in people like Leibniz and in writings like the Hermetica, in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and so on and so, or for that matter, Hegel. I don't think you could have had this explosion of physics without that philosophical groundwork that had been part of this theosophical turn of mind. Why? Because if you look at the spiritualists, the Swedenborgs, the Blavatskys, the Bulwer Lyttons, what do they emphasize? They all emphasize not only the power of mind and of consciousness. What they're really saying is the observer. And that, of course, is absolutely front and center in quantum mechanics. So you've got a huge philosophical turn that's happening that I don't think would have been possible in terms of modern physics without laying a big, huge philosophical groundwork before that.
And this is part of the observation changes the effect.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's, the uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics is very, very simple. You cannot measure the position of an electron and the momentum of an electron at the same time. Well, that means prior to making any measurement, you've determined the outcome. And of course that that has, that needless
Wow.
to say,
Yeah.
that set everybody, back on their rear end, because that wasn't supposed to happen.
Right. I do think it's fascinating. There's I like going back to this Steiner narrative where he says, look, about 1840, there's a clash in the mystery schools.
Mm-hmm.
Half of them say, keep the stuff hidden, the culture can't handle it. The other half says, scientific materialism has just invaded. In 100 years, these guys will be completely toast. They won't be able to lock in with anything relating to a spiritual idea, because science will become their new god.
Right.
So we're going to roll out stuff. We're going to roll out spiritualism. We're going to roll out reincarnation. We're going to give some of this information out. How viable do you think that is?
Oh, I think it's quite viable.
Yeah.
I've suspected something very similar myself, that there seems to have been a huge epistemological debate in the 19th century. And for a period, with the growth of Victorian scientific materialism, you had the spiritualists, the theosophists, the anthroposophists, and so on and so forth, on the other side of the equation, saying you need to look at this. Well, of course, they were roundly ignored.
Yeah.
In the 19th and early 20th centuries.
Yeah.
But then along came Heisenberg and the uncertainty principle, and there you are.
Yeah, right.
You can't ignore it anymore. So,
it's fascinating. It is, because it takes this kind of perspective. It's like this thing that wasn't there. And when we think about where it could have moved to, this is another thing that I'll go back to Steiner on. He gets to about 1916 and he says, basically, anthroposophy and theosophy have failed. They'll get a chance to rise again in 100 years. But he's looking at World War I and thinking this is a failure. As a matter of fact, he lets out a number of documents and lectures that he wasn't supposed to, that he said he wasn't going to, but he's like, you know what, let's put it all out there because people have to wake up and get this. But I have this question for you, which is, I read this when we started, and it's Steiner talking about Atlantis, and he gets to a point and he cuts off. So I just want to throw this at you real quickly. So Steiner, he's hinting at the dark arts of these Atlantean sorcerers, and he says, for the present, it's not permitted to make public communications about the origin of this knowledge and these arts. A passage from the Akasha Chronicle must therefore be omitted here. And I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, he started his own thing. He's anthroposophy and all the rest of it. What is it that is happening with somebody like him stopping when he's discussing these things?
I suspect, because I have to tell a personal anecdote here. I suspect because he is aware of certain concepts which, if they were fully understood, would be very, very dangerous. Dangerous in two ways. Dangerous in...
Joseph, I'm losing your voice signal for some reason.
Uh-oh. How about now? Are we good?
No, is that interesting? Olivia, do you have that?
I'm hearing.
Do you hear the crackle? I don't know what that is. How unusual. No, now you're fine again.
Okay. I turned up my microphone. Hopefully it'll be all right.
Oh, there it is again. It's a what is that? Is that, do you say hearing it's coming through? Interesting.
I don't know what's going on because my mic says it's okay.
It's a vibration. Hold on just a second here. Let's see.
I'm sure it's in tight. Sometimes it can be crackled if the wires are in tight.
Joseph, can you plug it out and plug it back in real briefly?
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. And it's great. Wow. We're here with Joseph Farrell, everybody. And this is the X series part 7. We're going deep on these societies holding information relating to advanced technology. And of course, we get the interference just as we're getting to the good part. Now,
Now.
oh yeah, terrific. I have no idea what that was, but it had that vibe of like interference, honestly. Like
I don't know what it would be.
it was
'Cause,
rhythmic, but we're good now. We're good.
but back to Steiner and why he would have hesitated.
Yes.
I think it's coming from two things. Number one, he's probably aware of some concept or doctrine that he knows is very dangerous. And it would be dangerous in two ways. Dangerous to certain people that are not fully aware of it.
Right.
So that if they were to encounter it, they would misinterpret it.
Mm-hmm.
And the other danger would be people that would be fully aware and that would seek to use it for very, very evil purposes and very destructive ones. That's my guess. I do think that there are such implications in some of the mathematical thinking of some of the ancients. They're very, very dangerous. So I don't talk about them. But I if he's thinking along the same lines as I think probably he was. And I don't know that much about Steiner, but I know enough about what people have said about him that kind of indicates to me that he was thinking in a very abstract sort of way. I do think that he's probably setting his own boundary there. In other words, it's not someone saying to him, "You can't talk about this." It's rather a natural response, of any individual that runs across this stuff. So that's where I think this is coming from. It's his own spirituality that's making him do that.
Okay, that's an excellent point, actually, because we have to look at, when we look at mystery schools, there's several levels there. Because, for example, even when we talk about the UFO file stuff now, there's a wall of government secrecy around that stuff. And that relates to corporate and deep state forces. But there's kind of a, and I did a show on John Keeley and Annie Besant and how she made great pains to hide his technology and make sure it wasn't gobbled up, basically. And again, we have that kind of mystery school, public mystery school in this case, reaching in and trying to prevent the public. And in fact, she says this is something that culture can't handle until it upgrades. And I'm thinking about what Steiner's doing, and we have to understand, I think very often when people think of mystery schools or secret societies of any kind, it's, they're going to think evil, basically. But when we understand that there are good secret societies and, less than good, dedicated to a totally different doctrine, then we have to understand the good ones might also adopt a kind of secrecy for different reasons. And so this is the track that I think that gets lost so often, is people say, well, if it was good, it would all be out in the open. And we find with a lot of these more altruistic groups, they get to a point where they say the culture needs to upgrade in order to accept this. So, yeah.
I have on my website, in my members area, a webinar on the material studies of Dr. William Tiller. And William Tiller is an interesting fellow because if you read him, it's almost like reading a theosophist or an anthroposophist. Because what he says is that you can alter the physical characteristics of material objects simply by an intention.
Wow.
Yeah. And he's documented this. This is not something that he's just made up and put out there. He's done the studies and he's documented this. For example, he has had people agree on the intention to raise or lower the pH levels, the acidity in organic materials, to raise or lower the gestation periods of fruit flies, to alter the lattice properties of metals. And
Hmm.
this is huge, because if you can do that, then let's go back to quantum mechanics. That means that this observer principle is not simply limited to small quantum effects.
Right.
It actually has a potential cosmological implication.
Hmm.
And that, you talk about dangerous.
In the wrong hands.
In the wrong hands, I would not want to see a colloquium of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin and Chairman Mao playing with this stuff. No way.
That is fascinating. It is interesting that nature of reality, we're in such a point where it's not like some advanced school that knows all these things can come forward and say, here, because we're in such a state where the developmental properties of the culture itself need to be upgraded in order to accept it, which is very interesting because, we look at a number of different groups from the past. And when we look at things like the Rosicrucians, for example, they with some interesting members. I found Walt Disney among their members recently. But
Sirhan.
Oh yes, fantastic. Gene Roddenberry. But one of the things about the Rosicrucians, which is fascinating, is they're kind of saying, well, you know what? It's the 16th century and it's time everybody knew. They're coming out, they're saying, we've been a mystery school for over a couple of thousand years, and now here we are.
And you have people like Robert Flood in England, very famous occultist, looking for them. Bacon, who thinks, well, they probably don't exist, so we'll just start one anyway.
Right. Yeah.
I'll tell you what my suspicion is. I've studied this stuff for a long time. My suspicion is that they are, and I'm going back now to let me find that book.
Yes.
Let me find that book, and I will read it. There we are.
You know that people want a shot of that bookshelf.
All right, here we go. Let me read this. We see, quote, we see that the old geometers have made use of a kind of analysis which they extended to the solution of all problems, albeit they have hidden it from posterity. I well realize that they must have known a kind of mathematics that was very different from today's common one. Not that I think they knew it perfectly. And indeed, some traces of this true mathematics seem to me to be still to appear in Pappus and Diaponticus, who, though not belonging to the most ancient ages, lived many centuries before our times. I would also think that later on, it was suppressed by its very authors because of a certain wicked slyness. That's René Descartes.
Wow.
Here's Isaac Newton.
Okay.
To be sure, the ancients' method is more elegant by far than the Cartesian one, for Descartes achieved the result by an algebraic calculus which, when transfused into words following the practice of the ancients, would prove to be so tedious and entangled as to provoke nausea, nor might it be understood. But they accomplished it by certain simple proportions, judging that nothing written in a different style was worthy to be read, and in consequence concealing the analysis by which they found their constructions. That's Newton. This is Leibniz. This is my favorite. The ancients seem to have recognized and possessed such an analysis proper to geometry, for in their works I think I can make out some vestiges of it, namely, of an algebra in which numbers are not the issue. Certainly, it is by this art that they unfolded those propositions, otherwise we would not have had them for such a long time, which only with difficulty would we find by using our modern methods. I think I have attained and discovered the foundation and first lineaments of this art, with which, once we have found the right symbols and established some principles, we can obtain everything else, listen carefully, by an imitation of calculating, and with no need to follow the lines with our imagination. That's yeah. So my suspicion is, looking at all of this esoteric lore, looking at the spiritualists, the theosophists, the anthroposophists, and so on, that whole 19th century movement, and in looking at the higher ranks of Masonry, my suspicion has always been that they are looking for some sort of analytical key that will be a formally explicit means of looking at all of those magical systems and saying, this is why it works.
All
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. And this key idea, I think, is absolutely fascinating, too. It's interesting because those 19th century movements, we have over and over again the idea of schools.
Yes.
And the idea of secret teachings in schools, and very often, I'd say 90% of the time, masters.
Yes.
So this is fascinating to me, because when we would look around now in the 21st century, in this kind of high-tech reality, if you could call it that, this idea of secret schools and masters seems further away from us than it would, say, at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century.
Yes.
But even then, it was kind of a fantastic idea.
Yes.
And we have people, like I mentioned, like Bulwer-Lytton and these people, referring to this type of thing also. But what is that strata there? That seems to me to be the tail end of a whole move by some part of these mystery schools to release information out to the public and see what happens.
Yes. Yeah, I think part of that release, I think I'm with you. I think that was a very deliberate move. But I'll tell you why I think in part that they did it. They, taking again those three quotations here, is, these three mathematical geniuses, one's an alchemist, the other guy sits around and invents analytical geometry, and then Leibniz, he's off in his own crazy little world all the time anyway. You look at what they're saying, and they're saying something huge. They're saying that there's a method of mathematical analysis that can be applied to consciousness itself. That's what they're really saying. So when you have these schools releasing this stuff, I suspect in part what they're also trying to do is they know that they're missing some key crucial insight, and therefore they're releasing enough information to see if anybody out there can come up with it.
Oh, they're kind of crowdsourcing.
Yeah. Bingo. Bingo.
That's fascinating.
Bingo. Exactly.
It's an experiment.
It's an experiment. Yeah. It's an experiment. And it's interesting that when you see this explosion happen, well, it's like I said before, what happens? You have the invention of quantum mechanics. They have to invent whole new kinds of mathematics just to even talk about it.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, I think it's been a huge experiment. I think that they are close to getting that key. everything that I've read, and I've read, I've got a whole shelf devoted to this whole topic over here. To give you one example, look at that book title.
Principles of Topological
Psychology.
I know topological metaphor.
Topological metaphor.
That's your key teaching.
There you have a psychiatrist dabbling in mathematics.
Wow.
To figure out, what is this mystery that we're calling consciousness.
Wow.
This has been going on, and everything tells me, they're getting close. They're getting very close. They're lacking one particular insight, I think, and that's the key that they've been looking for to turn this whole thing. William Tiller and his work, again, if you're members of my website, go in and look at that Tiller webinar, because you'll be blown away at what he did. And what he really did was he just sort of secularized Christian sacramental teaching and then applied it to material science, and boom.
Wow. Yeah.
It's just really kind of wild.
Yeah, that's incredible. I wanted to point out, well, by the way, speaking of these schools, I think that we're looking at really the descendants of the Pythagoras wave, because that was the music mathematics, and it seems like that is really...
Music is at the core of this. Music is at the core of this, because the creation of the Western tonal system that allows you to modulate keys in the middle of a piece, that was a huge physics unification. That was a purely mathematical adjustment. And what it's telling you is something very interesting about the cosmos and the cosmology. And I personally think the Pythagoreans knew this technique, and that was one of their big secrets. Wow. In other words, if you went back and listened to Pythagorean music, you'd be hearing Western tonal music 2,000 years before Mozart or Handel or whoever.
Right.
You'd be hearing that kind of music. I think that was their big secret. But what it's also telling you is it's a very interesting cosmology. And this cosmology is definitely part of this spiritualistic movement. And it's the idea that the cosmos is good, but it requires the mind of man. It requires logos. It requires reason to make a slight adjustment to it. In other words, the cosmos is presented to us as a puzzle to perfect. And if we don't do that, what happens? The cosmos falls apart.
Right. Chaos.
Bingo. Yeah. This is very much a part of their thinking. This is very much a part of their spirituality. It's really there. I mean, it's there big time in the Hermetica. So yeah, this I think is another part of this impetus that's coming out in this period that you're talking about. I hope I'm adding to your discussion.
Oh, absolutely.
Babbling on here,
Joseph. It's amazing. What's fascinating about this is I instantly, when we say Pythagoras, go to Egypt, because those were the schools that he was hearkening back to.
Yes.
Yeah. This sound thing is interesting, though, because you've pointed it out in relation to the Great Pyramid. And you've talked about how the Great Pyramid it's an analog. That's fascinating. Can you mention that a little bit here?
Well, the ancient way of thinking is highly analogical. In other words, you cannot understand the way the ancients think if you do not have a grasp of analogical thought. And analogies are, we use them all the time. It's how we learn. We take something that we learn from one context and we apply it to another context. And that's how we learn. And for the ancients, the way I think they understood the cosmos was they understood the cosmos as one big, huge analogy. So in other words, it was the stuff of creation itself. And it's the way that creation generates diversity and more information. And they applied this rigorously. The Egyptians were masters at it. You read Schwaller de Lubitsch, and he will talk about the hieroglyphs being highly analogical symbols. You have to think about them in order to understand them. And it was because of his ability to do that, to look at these symbols as multi-tiered kind of contrapuntal symbols that were designed to convey several layers of information at the same time. There's a case of a temple in Egypt where you have hieroglyphs on one wall and hieroglyphs on the other wall. And Egyptologists were trying to figure out, what is this saying? And de Lubitsch figured out that this was a three-dimensional thing, that you had to read the symbols on one wall and then the symbols on the other wall and kind of put them together. Yeah, it's just bizarre.
How advanced is that? Oh my God.
It's huge.
Yeah.
You know, if these people are thinking in 3 dimensions, even in their written language. You know?
I want to ask you a question kind of out of turn here.
Sure.
But it just made me think of it when you're talking about hieroglyphs. When we get around the UFO file and we get around cases where people have seen crash material, always we go back to hieroglyphs. What is going on there?
I don't know.
Yeah.
But I strongly suspect that there's an element of, and I'm kind of with Jacques Vallée here. I strongly suspect that there's an element of a psychotronic technology involved with UFOs. In other words, that these are technologies not just of advanced propulsion and anti-gravity. They're technologies that are mind manipulation technologies, that they have embedded, you know, going back to Dr. Tiller, that they have embedded intentionality in them. And that's the reason that they affect us in a certain way. So again, we're back to consciousness. Yeah. And if, you know, the presence of hieroglyphs on these things, you know, we've had stories from the Kecksburg Bell having some sort of hieroglyphs on them, to the Roswell crash with, you know, the strange little symbols on them. To me, that's an indicator you're dealing with a very kind of ancient analogical worldview, an analogical cosmology. So,
wow. Wait, well, the implications of that are pretty huge. It's the old ancient advanced thing.
Yep.
Now, what I think is interesting, since we're in the UFO and pyramid zone second here, this is interesting. So we've been following in the X series stuff that I've been doing, this X steganography, going through these, moving around this technology or question mark, whatever it is, through these different agencies using X as the identifier so they can follow it. And then as we've gone back, when I was looking, last week we were looking at the Theosophical Society and how that was coming up around Keeley and all the rest of it. But what's interesting is the pyramids and Egypt and what we were speaking of there with Pythagoras, the steganography is basically, that's the order of the day. The whole thing is steganography.
Yeah. And don't forget Christopher Columbus.
Yes.
And Pope Innocent VIII's tomb.
Okay.
How does Christopher Columbus sign his signature on the Pope's tomb? Well, he's got that X, little hooked X right on the Pope's tomb.
Yes. We talked about that, and before I was even doing the X series. What does that signify to you?
I think that if you take your idea that there is a steganography involved with these mystery schools, that you could probably press it back in history quite a ways. Yeah. Quite a ways. We've got to remember that these mystery schools preserved, you know, you can read Adam Weishaupt if you want to get the modern version of it. But here's a guy that's collecting methods of copying wax seals and invisible inks and
Right, yeah, right.
the whole 9 yards. So yeah, he's interested in encoding things, steganography, putting it out in the open, so that you can look at a symbol and say, aha, that's a brother lodge there,
Right.
and that's not over there. That's exactly what I think is going on, and I think it's very old.
Yes.
Very old. Very.
Yes. That is fascinating. There's a Casey reading regarding the pyramids.
Mm-hmm.
And they're asking him all about this book that's out at the time, which is kind of like revealing the Great Pyramid. And this guy claims to know the code of it and all the rest. And Casey's response is something like, well, he's the right idea that it can be read, but he hasn't read any of it correctly, or something along that line. And they say to him, well, they ask him a series of questions. Well, how could you read what's going on in the pyramid, And he talks about everything from how the Grand Gallery is designed, and even down to the type of stone. But he said that if you could read it, that you could basically, it's telling you future events down to the names of the people involved in major future events and the streets that they would live on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's pretty specific.
It's pretty specific. You get other versions of that idea that the pyramid is a kind of a Bible prophecy in stone. Most of those readings are based on a dispensationalist theology, which again is, problematic to me. However, if you look at the idea that these things, particularly the Great Pyramid, is a resonator, well, what's it resonating? Well, in my view, it's resonating local space-time. It's resonating the structure of local space-time. And if that's the case, it stands to reason then that it would have properties that look like they're referring to future things. Because if you do the mathematics of positions of planets and so on, you can predict where they are, and that's going to be entombed or enshrined, if you will, in the pyramid structure itself.
Right.
So to me, it's a resonating capacity that you're dealing with there. And that, to me, that's just another indicator that this was some big, huge machine of some sort designed to resonate local space-time. That's saying quite a lot. I know that's a bizarre hypothesis. I know that people hate it, but I'm sticking with it. By God.
Well, you have the series, the Giza Death Star book series, which is the most compelling stuff anywhere. But fundamentally, there's one thing that's interesting about it all, which is this resonance thing and this idea of sound as a creative tool or a destructive tool would go a great distance to explain how the pyramids were made in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. The Egyptians talk about priests levitating things with stone or with sound. You've got Tibetan Buddhist monks that say the same thing. So that tradition of sonic levitation is all over. Tesla, talking about his electroacoustical waves in the medium. Again, what he's really saying, the way you read him, if you read him carefully, is he's saying that there's a form of electricity that is really nothing but sound. It's a very, very high frequency sound. So, it's not a Hertz wave. It's a compression and rarefaction in the medium. It's a longitudinal wave, which, again, Tesla being Tesla, he's about the only one saying that out there.
Right. Or who understands it.
Or who understands it, yes. That's the other problem.
You really made me just think of something, which is fascinating, and it goes back to Steiner again. He's saying, as we progress, the next root race, that the act of creation will be through our vocal cords. And he says the first indication is that men, when they hit about 13, the voice changes.
Mm-hmm.
And he is reflecting that this reproduction
Mm-hmm.
you will speak things into creation, and
Mm-hmm.
he's moving into the whole sexual reproduction will become a thing of the past man. Now, a lot of these guys, including Gurdjieff, the
Yes.
Casey work, Steiner, they all talk about a period 200,000 years ago where there's the unisex.
Mm-hmm.
And now here's Steiner saying, well, the next leap is your throat becomes the creator. You're the sound
Mm-hmm.
that you make. What do
Mm-hmm.
you think of that in light of this?
Given what I've read of Dr. Tiller's research in the alteration of material properties simply by an intention to do so,
Right.
that intention, if you read what he says, that intention has to be spoken.
Oh.
It has to be spoken. It has to be agreed upon and then spoken, which I find very interesting because, again, that's a very ancient doctrine. You have it in the doctrine of the Christian sacraments. You have to speak certain words in order for the sacrament to be effective. You have the same thing in ancient Hinduism. You have the idea of Om, of the primordial syllable. In Freemasonry, you have the idea of the lost chord, some sort of harmonic that is the fundamental chord of all other chords, speaking
Right.
musically. So in other words, again, you have this idea of sound. You have an idea of sound in some of the ancient Egyptian Edfu texts, a primordial sound.
So is that other one kind of like the cracks in the keyboard idea?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Keyboard. Yeah. That's a whole other thing.
I know.
Well, no, it's germane to this because, there is a doctrine in the Baroque era of music. Why does that music do certain things? Well, it's because it's formula music. It's like film music. You do certain things to convey certain emotional passions that are universal to human nature. So in other words, they are literally using certain musical procedures to produce certain affects in the listeners. It's mind manipulation. And that's a doctrine that's almost completely unknown today.
Wow.
But it was very much a part of the thinking of, Bach, Palestrina, people like that. They were schooled in it. This was part of their formal musical training. And incidentally, if you look at those Baroque musical theory texts, the terminological borrowings from alchemy are all over the place.
Mm-hmm. You're right.
So what does that tell you?
Right. Yes. You opened up alchemy there. Wow.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's all related. All of this whole Hermetic impulse that begins with the Renaissance. People just don't understand how the profound effect it has had, just across the board. The sciences, the arts, you name it, it's there.
Wow.
It's huge.
Yeah.
And it's all dealing with the science of consciousness. So I don't think this idea is far off at all.
Mm-hmm.
That they will get to a state where they understand the effect of consciousness on the material world, where you can literally do these sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
I think in fact they've been running experiments in this sort of stuff. Yeah, Mandela effect.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Interesting. That is, if we can make you observe something and see it differently, then we change the medium.
Yeah, will it have? Yeah, precisely. Will it have a cosmological effect?
Wow.
Yeah,
that's incredible.
And here's the problem: if you create different perceptions or different perceptions of timelines, what are you creating? Well, you're creating chaos.
Yes. Yeah, no question about it. Even in the few instances where they've really done it in a bold way. Because I know that there's about 100 examples that are as fake as you can get, but there are those real ones. We have seen that Mandela effect in play, and we know that somebody was trying something out there. There's no question.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think they're doing macrocosmological consciousness observer experiments.
Wow.
That's what I think they're doing. Yeah. That should make everybody a little nervous.
Well,
Yeah.
just to follow Tiller for a minute, why and these traditions, and the traditions no doubt have been there about you need to say it, and that's the way. Even in prayers and all the rest of it,
right?
It has to be said. You have to be able to speak it forth. Why? Why couldn't I just think it? You know, I'm devotional. I'm thinking it, and that's it.
I think it's because fundamentally, we are human beings, are both physical and spiritual beings. So in other words, to merely think something doesn't engage our whole being. So in other words, it doesn't have the same cohering effect in creating a field of information as it would if you are agreed in speaking things into a field of information.
I see.
You know, I could go on and on, but let's look at one example of speaking things into a field of information.
Okay.
Look at churches. Churches are built, most of the churches in Europe are built on old pagan sites, or they're built on certain nodal points or ley lines and so on and so forth. Well, what do you have in churches? You've got organs.
Right.
And what do organs do? Well, organs are unusual musical instruments in the sense that you're sitting inside the instrument soundboard.
Right.
A grand piano, you're sitting outside the soundboard. Listening to a violin, you're sitting outside the soundboard. In a church, you're sitting inside the instrument because the instrument's the building.
Right.
So what are you doing? You're resonating stuff in the building, and that in turn is resonating it into the earth itself.
Okay.
Ah.
Oh, that was some changes. Yeah.
Oh, golly. Maybe there's a reason that they were thinking in alchemical terms back then when they were writing their music.
Rippling effects.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're putting information into the field. And again, I think this is simply coming out of the constitution of humanity itself. We're spiritual and we're material beings. So in order to affect the field, we have to be both consciously involved in the intention, and we have to be physically putting that intention out there with our speech or artistic creation or whatever it is that we're doing.
Wow.
So it's a kind of very high magic.
Why do those esoteric traditions cling to this idea? Obviously, I mean, they think it's true. How valid do you think the idea is of this unisex character? They clock it usually, I find it around 200,000 BC when they said the sexes split.
I think it's very valid. When Dr. DeHart and I wrote the transhumanism book, we were dumbfounded to find this idea of, and we had to create an oxymoron to describe it, this idea of the masculine androgyne. And we kept running into this. Why is that there?
Yeah. And,
you know, you find this idea of the unisex even in Judaism. You find it in the Palestinian Talmud. You find it in Maximus the Confessor, a very famous Orthodox saint who, in his version of this unisex androgyne, the sexes were split in prevision of the fall, but the actual original state of humanity was as an androgyne. And again, you find it in Mesoamerican literature and doctrine. You know, where is this coming from?
Right, right.
Why is it there? And we had to puzzle out why would they think of this as a masculine androgyne? And what we thought they might have been doing was, again, they're thinking analogically. If they had a high science, and every indication is that they did, then if they're looking at males and females, they'll have noted something about males that's very different from females. Males carry both sexes. It's the male that's the determiner of the sex of offspring.
Uh-huh.
Females don't. And we thought, well, if that's the way they're thinking, if they're looking at things analogically, then if they've got this idea of an androgyne, they're projecting this genetic sexual determiner at large onto the cosmos. And we ran into this from China to Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica. It was all over the place.
Yeah.
And that was the only thing that we could think of that they may have been thinking, trying to reverse engineer whatever thought process is going on in their head. Part of it was musical too, because they also looked at masculinity and femininity. The feminine always reproduced the octave of a note. So in other words, their thinking was that the octave was the feminine principle in music.
Mm-hmm.
All the notes in between the octave, the diversification, the distinguishing, that was the masculine principle. So it's there even in the way they thought about music.
Interesting.
That somehow the masculine is the the differentiating function in the cosmos. Very weird stuff. Very,
Wow.
very weird stuff.
Well, it's interesting because we see such a mutation of that now, because when you look at it in ancient times, the top of that tree of life is an androgyne figure,
Yes,
right?
yes.
He's the ultimate,
Yes.
or it's the ultimate.
For it, yeah.
Yeah.
Whatever. But it is a masculine androgyne. There's no getting around it. This is what they were thinking. And the only thing that we could come up with was, why were they thinking that? Well, they had to have been thinking of it in terms of genetics. That the human male is the sexual differentiator in procreation. Very, very weird stuff. We ran into so much weird stuff investigating that book. It's not even funny. It just boggles our mind. And half of it we didn't even write about because it was just,
I want to read that book. I haven't read that one yet. But what I find is so interesting when we've talked about it is there's that whole transhumanist movement now.
Uh-huh.
But it's almost like a warped version of this thing. It's
yes.
Back then in alchemy and all the rest of it, you're thinking, I have to earn these levels so I can climb up the next branch of the tree of life. And when I get to the top, there I am.
Right.
And there's this weird thing going on where they're like, and there's even a warning about it in religious texts and in esoteric texts that says people who climb up some other way.
Yes.
And so now we have this thing about people climbing up some other way by projecting. Okay, you've got a real kind of hardcore scientific guy who wants to merge with technology.
Uh-huh.
Kurzweil, he's a good example. But we know quite a few of them now. And they just want to get to that level. They want to be at that top without actually achieving it. They don't want to kind of go through the steps of spiritual development to do it.
Right. Right. We looked at transhumanism as basically a recasting of this whole alchemical doctrine of androgynous man, then you have mineral man, vegetable man, and then animal man, which is in esoteric thinking is where the sexes are actually split.
Okay.
So you've got basically an androgynous principle in those first three stages. Well, look at what transhumanism is doing. If you look carefully, they're trying to climb back up that ladder, the fusion of the human and the machine. There's mineral man for you.
Right.
The fusion of the human and plants, all of this miscegenation that geneticists are practicing. Again, they're trying to climb back up that ladder. This current move to deal with gender as if it's the same thing as sex and that you can define things by language alone.
Right. Yeah. Definitely.
rather
That's
than
that was
rather, yeah, that's the big one. And
don't call him a he or a she, or
yeah,
you get into trouble.
yeah, you know, that's a very Gnostic way of trying to do this, and eventually it short circuits because uh, you can't base reality on linguistic make believe.
Right,
It doesn't work too well.
Joseph, you'll love this. Up here, Olivia and I were talking about this case that just happened. Somebody sent it to me. But it's here in Massachusetts. There's this case where they are punishing this kid because he was calling his friend his best friend. And they said, well, that causes problems. And they're adopting this thing where the kids in the school can't say best friend.
Oh, jeez. Yeah, this is not a path to having a society that's functional.
Yeah, right.
It ain't gonna work.
Embrace the state now.
Yeah, exactly.
Big Brother
Exactly.
loves you. I I sent you something about these X's and Plato, but I'm going to run through them real quickly because I think you find it interesting. But before I do that, I have to show you this because when I came across it, I was fascinated. So in about 1884, there's this very famous medium operating out of Virginia, and she has this enterprising husband. Excuse me, brother. And he kind of gets all these people into her mediumship and all the rest of it. And during that mediumship, he asks, I want to make a thing where people could understand what you're doing. And this is where the Ouija board comes from.
Mm-hmm.
And at a certain point, he says, what can I call the game? And she says, call it Ouija. And but as he's designing it and all the rest of it, he gets this great idea about using all these symbols. And I'm going to show you the first version of the Ouija board, and I'm going to ask you for your live comment here.
Okay.
Oh,
holy cow.
First version of the Ouija board.
Oh, my word.
And he goes on to call his company the Swastika Trading Company.
Oh, jeez. Well, no Nazis here. I mean, that's show it again. That's the swastika going. Yeah, that's going counterclockwise. That's supposed to be a symbol of blessing, good fortune, and all of that good stuff. Wow. Wow.
I thought you'd appreciate that. When I came across it, I was like, because here we go with the spiritualism, which we know so much of the theosophical and anthroposophical work was pilfered by these German mystical groups also.
Yes.
And misappropriated many of the themes.
Oh, totally.
Yes.
Really bad misappropriation. Guido von List and Lanz von Liebenfels and
yes,
Baron Sabotendorf and all of these people that took all of that theosophical teaching and just mangled it hopelessly.
How can I read this and make Aryans superior? No.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
I find it interesting when a lot of the journals that are kind of like academic journals looking back, because I review everything on every side of the fence. And when they're looking back on theosophy, they're saying, oh, but we can see how dangerous these movements are because look at how her ideas were misappropriated by the Nazis, Well, what about Bulwer Lytton? I mean, they pilfered his ideas too. What are you going to do? Stop writing sci-fi novels?
Yeah, they did. The will to power will distort and twist anything.
Yes.
It's a hallmark of all sorts of Gnostic movements that have the will to power. They'll latch on to anything. Think of Marx and Hegel. Marx latches on to Hegel and just utterly garbles the whole thing. And you end up with the purges
right.
in the Soviet Union. So
yeah, and it's fascinating. There is that incredible esoteric angle.
Oh yeah,
Nazi rise.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's
you can't look at the Nazi party rallies and see anything else other than occult ritual.
Yeah.
Writ large. Everything is calculated very, very carefully. In fact, if you look at those rallies, you'll always have Hitler, Hess, and either Goering or Himmler, 3 people. And that's coming right out of Joachim Fiore, that medieval dispensationalist that I mentioned earlier.
Right.
Because he's got the 3 figures constantly in his
Yes.
thinking. So, the Nazis are latching on to all of these symbols and twisting them. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. Well, what's that from? That's from the book of Ephesians: one Lord, one faith, one baptism. It's a twisting of everything.
Wow.
And, over and over again, you get this in Nazism.
Wow. It's fascinating. There was something that you pointed out about their kind of strange focus and obsession around sacred objects.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Power objects. Himmler was obsessed with them. Hitler, to a certain extent, was obsessed with them. To get all of these power objects and bring them to Germany and literally own them. I even think that there may have been a possibility, had Hitler won the war, of him being crowned Kaiser, of a revivified Holy Roman Empire, because they were collecting all of the imperial regalia.
Amazing.
So
there's that one that you pointed out, which was the spear. That's
Spear of Longinus. Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, that was taken from the Hofburg. Hitler, when the Anschluss with Austria happened, Hitler went directly to the Hofburg to view the imperial crown jewels, and they were boxed up. And the Spear of Longinus was actually sent to Nuremberg and kept there in Nuremberg for, the big party rallies and all of that good stuff. Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
Wow. Incredible.
Yeah.
They understood. There's definitely an occult
Oh, yeah.
know-how, deep knowledge on the side of the Nazis, and their appropriation not only of the themes but of the objects is real sorcery.
Well, look at the other thing that they appropriate. They appropriate neuro-linguistic programming techniques, big time, constant use of them.
Right.
It's really, there's no technique that they did not explore and that they did not use. Right. You can't explain taking a modern great power and making it go collectively insane.
Yeah. Without
having an understanding of their use of these types of techniques, because it's everywhere. It's absolutely everywhere. Just look at Hitler's gestures alone sometime when he's speaking.
Yeah.
You'll see this ancient occult technique of Sprachlogik, using gestures to punctuate particular parts of speech. And some of the gestures are very chilling, very, very chilling.
Mm-hmm.
The symbolism of them, if you stop and examine what he's doing and think about the symbolism, it's very, very chilling.
He's there's also a big party platform about Atlantis and how they're the descendants of Atlantis and all the rest of it. So yes. Very openly esoteric.
Yes, absolutely. William Henry, I don't know if you're familiar with his work. I like William's work because he's very familiar with the occult. He wrote a book years ago called One Foot in Atlantis. And it's a study of occult technique and symbolism in the United Kingdom, United States, and Nazi Germany during World War II. And it's chilling because when you look at what he says about Nazi Germany, he's making it very clear that you have here a great power that is dedicated consciously to revivifying Atlantis in modern times.
Mm-hmm.
And, look at the Ahnenerbe and their collection of occult objects and study of occult lore and doctrine and so on and so forth. It's very, very clear that this is what they're up to.
It's fascinating because it's like the exact opposite of what these schools like
Yes.
theosophy and anthroposophy are trying to push. It's almost like this reverse upside down version.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's like the tarot card upside down.
Yes.
I wanted to touch base on this, and I'm just curious where it will go, so we'll just ride with it. But it'll take us to the X and the Eleusinian mysteries.
Mm-hmm.
So let's first, I'm going to take a look at this figure who is
Oh, wow. Hecate.
Hecate. Yes.
Uh-huh.
You know where we're going. Of course,
Walter Bosley should be here.
I know. Yes. Well, it's 3 in 1, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Last week we were talking about this Janus character, 2 heads in 1.
Mm-hmm.
On her temples, we find this. They call it the equal armed cross, and this one is in modern day Turkey.
Yep. Cross in the circle. Yep.
This, of course, what does that remind you of?
Statue of Liberty. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say that looks a lot like the Statue of Liberty. And we won't explore that too much, but what I found was there was an excellent book and essay called The Celestial Intersection on Roman Coins by George Latorre, who was an author I wasn't familiar with. And when I was exploring the X stuff, I ran into his work, and he's the only person, as far as I know, who's raised this X that apparently Plato states in Timaeus and in the Republic, the cosmic X. And he's referring to how God has kind of fashioned this crossroads. And tracing it back further, he learns that the Eleusinian mysteries took place under this occasion of a starry night where you could really see this X in the sky.
Right.
And he goes into it. And so just a quick quote here. The zodiacal light rises from the horizon, envelops the planets along the ecliptic, and intersects the Milky Way, revealing the celestial crossroads, Plato's X, the location of the gates of heaven. That's how it's referred to. The celestial intersection of Plato's X could be seen on imperial coins over hundreds of years, where it proclaimed Rome's control of the gates of heaven. So I grabbed some of these coins. One of them, this coin actually shows this emperor holding the goddess there.
Yep.
But these are more blunt about the X. And one of the things I pointed out to Olivia is that it looks very much like the Pine Gap logo. It is the spinning image, but this is interesting. I think this is more of the coins. And here is the X.
Push it up above.
Near the sun and the moon.
Oh, yeah, I see it. Yep.
You see that?
Yep, I sure do.
And he goes into quite a series. There's shot after shot of it showing up, so there's no question about it.
Yeah.
This one I find interesting, and it starts to show up lower as we go. This person's sitting on it. It's at their feet.
Yep.
But over and over again, now we have Plato's X, and it's right in the heart of the same document where he's discussing Atlantis.
Yeah.
So in terms of steganography, interestingly enough, I found that this X got cycled out, and they started using a different version, and they would use it around the first 2 letters in Greek for Christ.
Right. Yep. Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely.
So what are we bumping into and bumping up against here with this Plato's X in the sky?
Well,
and the Eleusinian mystery aspect.
Well, there's two parts to this. I'm going to give you a patristic answer, and I'm going to give you an esoteric answer, and they're kind of the same.
Okay.
The church fathers were not we have this idea now that, oh, you've got all of these myths, ancient myths of the dying God and all of this stuff, and therefore Christianity is not true. If you go back and read the church fathers, they had exactly the opposite view. They were very familiar with all these different mythologies, and the way they looked at it was that this symbolism, the symbolism of the cross in the heavens and so on and so forth, was actually part of the cosmological fabric, if you will. In other words, it was a magical doctrine that was just taken over whole cloth into Christianity.
Right.
The lamb that was slain before the foundation of the world, to give the biblical reference. I suspect that if you push back behind Plato, and particularly the fact that this is a symbol that occurs in the Timaeus, in the Atlantis dialogue, I suspect that this is a symbolism that's coming from, for whatever reason, pardon me, is coming from that ancient high civilization.
Yeah.
There was some sort of a scientific basis for this, that they understood certain celestial configurations gave an entry into heaven. That is to say, an entry into the understanding of the way the cosmos operated, and therefore, if you understood that, you could manipulate it. So you've got both things going, and it's neither one, I don't think, are really all that contradictory to the other. I think that this is part of the cosmological fabric of reality. It's part of their analogical way of thinking that's manifesting itself again. And they're quick to point out the way that the ancient mind would think. If they saw a symbol here and they saw a symbol there, and it was the same symbol, then it had to have, particularly if it was in cultures or contexts that were far removed from each other, it had to have some sort of beginning in a cosmological phenomenon. That's just kind of the way they think.
Right.
Which, again, I think it's a way of thinking that's innate to humans. It's the way we think about everything.
Right. Right.
Really get right down to it. So I don't, I've never had difficulties with these ancient doctrines. I really haven't. I think they're much more sophisticated than we give them credit for. I hope that's making some sort of sense.
It does, yeah. And what's interesting is, what I find is that the Eleusinian aspect is interesting, because Hecate shows up there, and
absolutely,
she's the gatekeeper.
She's the gatekeeper. I think you can make a case that she's kind of a reworking of Isis, and Isis's classic portrayal with her finger to her lips. Keep this secret.
Yes, I've seen that.
Yeah, I think there's a certain case to be made that Hecate is kind of a rehashing of Isis, and I also think that with Hecate you also get some parallels to Ishtar, the Babylonian goddess,
right?
It has kind of the same function,
right?
Kind of a gatekeeper. Mother wisdom, Sophia. Keep certain things quiet, keep certain things in your breast, don't talk about certain things. That's a very hermetic idea, that some things are, we talked about this before, that certain things are too dangerous to be talked about openly.
Exactly. Wow.
There's a lot of symbolism in this, a whole lot of symbolism. I do think ultimately there's a science behind this, why they're concentrating on this.
Yeah, absolutely. But what I instantly thought is exactly what you said, which is the Plato's X goes back to Egypt.
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly. It does. And with the Christ, with the borrowing and the portrayal of Christ in the domes of churches, what they're telling you is something very interesting. They're telling you that logos, or reason, or to give it a Latin translation that you sometimes run into, ratio, which is the Latin word for what? Well, it's the Latin word both for reason and for proportion. In other words, they're telling you that this is a mathematical mystery. It's a mathematical reason that you're dealing with. It's a musical harmony that you're dealing with. So again, these are very, very rich symbolisms that carry through for millennia.
Yeah. Wow. That is fascinating. It's the musical aspect is huge, and
huge, yes.
Can you conjure up in your mind the picture of the School of Athens, Raphael's painting?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And here's an interesting thing that on the esoteric side, which is both.
Yeah.
You're right. The whole painting, pretty much.
Yeah.
Casey,
who are all those other little figures?
Yes.
What are they doing in here?
Some of them are only from the waist down when you get up there. And others reaching up with so many different scenes. It's an incredible. It would take a long time to actually look at it. And embedded in the middle of it, kind of like a director in his own movie, is Raphael.
Yes. Yes.
It's pretty incredible. Now, here's an interesting kind of trivia about it, which is that both Steiner and Edgar Casey say that Raphael was John the Baptist previously.
Could be.
Which is, one of those things that they put out there. I just thought it was interesting that they both connected on the same idea. But interestingly enough, on one of those coins, and on the predominant Roman coins of this X, which is Plato's X, around this world, this globe, there's a figure who looks remarkably, in that painting on the lower level, who looks remarkably like one of those emperors with his foot on the globe, but there's no X. And I went all through that painting just for the heck of it. And the only X in the painting is on Pythagoras and what he's drawing. And I thought, this is interesting. If I were to think of it in terms of code, that the X had somehow moved out of this Plato-Roman idea
back to Pythagoras. Well, Raphael was well schooled in esoterica.
Yeah.
So it would not surprise me that he's sending a little message there.
Yeah, right.
Don't look to Plato. This actually is a little older than that.
And of course, Plato's right in the center of the painting.
And he's right in the center, doing this, and Aristotle, yeah.
And he's got the Timaeus with him.
Yep. Atlantis. Gosh, I wonder what Raphael was trying to say.
He's trying to tell us something, and Plato's trying to tell us something. In Timaeus. Timaeus is extraordinary. I went back and reviewed it. I hadn't read it in many years, and
all of Plato's dialogues are very, very interesting. Do you know what most of them are?
No.
Get a hold of a couple of books by Professor Ernest McLean.
Okay.
And there's another one out called The Musical Structure of Plato's Dialogues.
Oh.
Most of his dialogues, if you read them with attention to the mathematics in them, are treatises of music theory.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. And it's interesting, in the Republic, what does he say about Atlantis? Well, Atlantis was based on a base 10 system. Think metric. And it fell apart.
Right.
But the system that works the best is dodecaphonic, 12.
Oh.
What's our musical system?
12, yeah, 12 tone.
Dodecaphonic. It's Sumerian. It's sexagesimal.
Yeah, right.
And that means it's Pythagorean.
Right.
So, wow. So
that's so interesting.
Yeah.
Well, where we have in the musical scale the half steps.
The half step. If you look at the natural harmonic series, I advise people to go watch the first lecture of Leonard Bernstein in 1973 at the Harvard Norton Poetry Lectures, because what he does is he outlines the harmonic series for everybody. And the fifth overtone in the naturally occurring harmonic series, if you use the note C as your fundamental starting point, the fifth overtone in the natural harmonic series is going to be located between the note A and B flat. In other words, it's in the crack.
Okay.
It's in the crack on the keyboard. Here we
are with that.
Right.
In the crack. Okay.
Right. But what happened was you cannot modulate, you cannot change keys in a piece if you use the natural harmonic series. So they simply did a little mathematical adjustment to allow all 12 notes on the keyboard to function in any key so that you didn't have to stop and change and tune the instrument.
Okay.
Now there's different tuning systems, but I do think if you go back and look at the Pythagoreans and what they said about music, they were very aware of this problem. They called it the comma. It's called the Pythagorean comma. And they were aware enough mathematically, in my opinion, that they probably would have figured out how to make that adjustment so that you could have a well-tempered system.
Okay.
So I think that was their big secret. One of their big secrets. And Plato's just, putting it all out there for everything.
So are you saying that by the time we get to the Western version of treating this, we're actually degrading because we miss?
No, I'm not saying that we're degrading anything. What I'm saying is there are people out there that would argue that. I'm saying the exact opposite. I'm saying that given the cosmology that these people are operating with, they're viewing the universe as a puzzle. It's created good, but it takes that last tweaking by logos or ratio or proportion.
Okay.
To tweak it and make it perfect.
I see.
So I'm saying the exact opposite of what a lot of modern musical scholars are saying.
Okay.
I'm saying this was their big secret. And it's very interesting when the Renaissance occurs, what happens to music? You start getting modern sounding Western music.
Right.
Because all of that Hermetic esoteric doctrine from Pythagoras on forward is now out in the open. So it's changed our music. We can't have the Beatles without this system of tuning. We cannot have, Shania Twain. We can't have Bach. We can't have any of these people without this system of tuning.
Yes, it's totally changed.
It's totally changed.
Yeah, and that's our entire reality. And all the emphasis that we've seen and in our discussion that's been put on sound, if you think about that, it's a pretty big deal.
Oh, huge.
Yeah.
It's a cosmological thing that they did, because again, the music of the spheres, the harmony of the spheres was a cosmological doctrine for them. So it became, to a certain extent, for that way of thinking, it became an essential step that they had to make. Listen to Western music, then go listen to a Hindu raga, which doesn't change keys, and you listen to this stuff for 40 minutes and you're going to be,
yes.
You're going to be exhausted at the end because it doesn't go anywhere.
Absolutely.
It's very creative and it's got lots of interesting stuff going on, but it's stuck in the same key.
Yes. There's no question about it. And that puts us into like a weird alpha state.
Yeah, it does. It does. Absolutely, it does. So yeah, this to me, this whole analogical way of thinking, it's coming out of all of these esoteric doctrines. There's no doubt in my mind, and you really get that impression about Plato and Pythagoras if you sit down and read Professor McLean's book. I talked about him in Giza Death Star, so way back when. And I talked a lot about music in Grid of the Gods and what's going on and why these people are thinking this way about the cosmos and music at the same time.
Yeah, right. I have not come across an explanation of Timaeus saying it's a musical work. That is absolutely fascinating.
Oh yeah, it is. It is.
And it's interesting in terms of communication, because we know a lot of these groups, there's an interesting story about a relative of Gurdjieff who speaks the entire Gilgamesh legend before they find it. And then during Gurdjieff's lifetime, they run across it and he hears it and he says to himself, my God, the oral tradition preserved it.
Preserved it. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we know with any tribe, tribal culture, of course, there's all of that with the Aborigines also. Before we go any further, Olivia, you got a lot of good questions over there, I can imagine.
I do.
Okay, now what we'll do here is we're going to run right into questions, but I want to sum up something and ask you, Joseph. I wanted to make sure before we go to questions, I had asked you this, and it relates right to those coins that we were looking at.
Before we go to questions, let me take a little break.
Yes, perfectly.
I'm sitting here drinking tea, you know.
Nicely done. So, well, I'll remind everyone that you're watching Dark Journalists, and we're here with Dr. Joseph Farrell having a fascinating discussion. This is part 7 of the X series, and definitely there's something coming in here, which is, we started so heavily going in with the technological aspect of following the X through these different government agencies, referring strictly to it as an unknown technology or the UFO file moving around. And we saw very compelling things that have come to light now since this. And now we're moving into what the whole of the steganography is. And the question that I'm going to ask Joseph, you going to leave now or are you coming back?
Okay, yeah, I'll leave now. I'll be right back.
Okay, super. And I'm going to get to this question with Joseph, but what we've been talking about and why it's so great to have Joseph here is because when we go into those realms of dealing with the mystery schools, when you're going back in time and the references change and what we might think they're talking about has changed because, we know language changes so much. I was reading a book called The Time Falling Bodies Take to Light. I think it's William Irwin Thompson. And it's a fascinating book. It's got a lot of 60s lingo in it, and the Esalen Institute is in it, and Joan Baez and all these people. But it's a kind of interesting back and forth about that period and people thinking about 60s revolution and all the different things that were available. But the language is unbelievably dense and laden with all of these kind of phrases and catchphrases from the period that you're really like, wow, in only 50 years, our culture has changed so much that so much of these, the kind of colloquialisms of the time are really very, very different. But I find it interesting anyway. I mean, I actually love that stuff when it happens. But we can see when we're looking back to a period, if we go back even to the language that Theosophy was using a little over 100 years ago, and in Steiner's case, it's German translation into English. Those aren't in English, which is why there was some concern about his lectures coming out and being bastardized in a sense, because you've got the translation and the person writing it down. And if they say something a little bit off, then Steiner's whole reputation is riding on the accuracy of their transcript and then the translation after that. So you have to go very, very hardcore into it to get to the real thing. So when we want an all-star, you get an all-star. Joseph, you're back.
I'm back, yes.
It's great to see you, and it's just terrific to have you on for this. The X that the Roman emperors, Plato's X that the Roman emperors are putting on their coins.
Mm-hmm.
My question for you, and I'll give everyone one more look at it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that steganography, or are they absent-mindedly just plugging in themselves to this power circuit, and Plato has the real steganography in the tail?
Oh, that's a good one.
Did they know or not? I guess.
Well, I think you can reach a certain point in the decay of the Western Empire where things are simply being done by rote without much understanding. But that said, I think given the way that the Roman mind thought, that the genius of the empire, and I'm using the term genius in its full Platonic sense here, that the genius of the empire was Roman administration, and Caesar being deified was the deification, literally, of the Roman state. That use of that symbol to claim a direct cosmic connection with the cosmic order, and that's a very, very typical thing for empires in that period. The Babylonians did this, the Egyptians did this, the Assyrians had this idea. They all had this idea, even the Chinese, that their empire had to be a reflection of the cosmic order.
Okay.
So yeah, I think it's very deliberate steganography, and I think it's also a very deliberate appropriation of the symbol in order to claim that kind of heavenly order. To say, yes, we've got the approval of heaven here, and it carries over, of course, into the Christian empire. So yeah, I think this is not accidental at all in the earliest period. By the collapse of the late empire, yeah, it may be kind of a rote thing, but
right.
The Eastern Empire preserves and goes on for another 1,000 years, and it certainly was grounded enough in all of this ancient lore that I think it's very, very definitely there. It got to the point in the Eastern Empire that the throne of the emperor was actually for two people, and the emperor sat on the left side, and supposedly the other part of the throne was for Christ himself. So in other words, again, you've got this symbolism. You're claiming the divine order, and that you're the earthly representative of it.
Wow.
Yeah.
I've never seen. I have to look at that. That sounds amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it's there. They had a whole elaborate imperial symbolism in the East Roman Empire. That's you find a lot of these symbols being carried over. Lions to the side of the throne, devices to make the throne levitate in front of emissaries, and just all sorts of wild stuff. But yeah,
the Caesar becoming a god right before.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what they're doing. Yeah,
amazing. It reminds me of the Ptolemaic period of Egypt, where even the embalming starts to get bizarre. Mm-hmm. And when you're looking at it, it's so they've lost whatever it was, and the buildings become bizarre. The dress is like, what's going on? And
mm-hmm.
the language is confused. I mean, it is fascinating when things degenerate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No question about it. I am going to turn it over to Olivia, who's been very patient.
Here we go.
Okay, so a lot of the chat members know that I have been coughing. I've been trying to hide that, so I apologize.
No,
I've been
you're
a little compromised tonight.
What? You're fine.
Well, I'm going to have another cigarette and probably join you in the coughing.
All right. So I want to leap into the first question, which is really about the Ascended Master.
Oh, I like that.
And throwing it out to you and to Joseph and what you think of them.
Isn't that interesting? I would love to hear Joseph's take on that.
Ascended Masters, explain.
What are the Ascended Masters? Do you think they're real? Let's start with that.
You'd have to tell me more about what you're referring to.
Oh, okay. Well, the Ascended Masters is kind of something that came up through Theosophy, but largely Saint Germain and Lord Maria and all these different masters would appear to people, and they guided Blavatsky, and they guided these members, and Alcott met with the masters, and they produced these incredible paintings of them because they could materialize these letters, like the Mahatma letters and all the rest of it. So the Ascended Masters, that's kind of a good snapshot of them. They show up in other traditions. The Ascended Masters come up in the Great White Brotherhood, for example, and often Saint Germain is in there kind of leading the way.
Well, I don't know enough about the doctrine or Theosophy to comment, other than my guess is that with a lot of these mystery schools, you've got to have some sort of, to my way of thinking, you have to have some sort of spiritual connection with something or somebody else out there to be coming up with some of this stuff. Now,
Yes.
you know, whatever they're in contact with, are they in contact with angels, demons, you know, disembodied? Who knows? I don't know.
Right.
But the way I'm looking at it, there's too much spiritual content going on here for me to write off just to a bunch of people sitting around, you know, thinking up doctrines.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The secret doctrine kind of blows that away right there.
Yeah. I don't get that impression from a lot of this stuff that these people are just dreaming these things up. I do get that impression, however, when I turn to people like Guido von List or Lance von Liebenfels, these people that are taking theosophical doctrine and twisting it.
Yes.
I do get the impression that these people are just literally in the business of conjuring their own doctrines and, you know, selling their own books and creating their own movement.
Well, I think von List actually was trying to make Ariosophy, because it sounds like anthroposophy, so that, you know, people would associate his weird Ariosophy thing with that, which is totally different.
Right.
Go ahead.
I don't rule out the spiritual thing. I mean, you know, the story is that even Napoleon had some sort of spiritual experience at Giza inside the Great Pyramid, you know, and this is like the last guy in the world that you would think of having any sort of spiritual experience. but you know, nonetheless, it's there.
They're out there operating on a different level. And one thing I would say about this that's kind of fascinating, drawing off Steiner, referring to Blavatsky, who he had a lot of respect for, but also saw that people kind of monkeyed with her perceptions. He said that at a certain point that she, understanding many of these esoteric brotherhoods, went to them and said, I want to join. And they said, you're a woman, no way.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, if you don't, and this is in America, and they were associated, according to him, with political groups in America.
Mm-hmm.
And that she said, if you don't, I'm going to this school in Paris who will accept me, and I'll divulge all your secrets because I know them.
Mm-hmm.
And that they decided as a group to put her in an occult imprisonment, where formerly she had a clear vision dealing with these masters and everything else. And now they could actually precipitate these thought forms to look like the same people she was dealing with. So she was getting conflicting advice. And interestingly enough, her work, if you track it after a certain period, from 1875 to Isis Unveiled, and then the later books get a little more confused. It's a very interesting thing that he's talking about there. But that's pretty out there too. It's pretty wild to think of them collectively putting her in this state.
I don't think it's all that wild, because you hear in some schools of remote viewing this idea of remote influencing.
Okay.
So I can see them doing something like that with her, particularly in this country. You know, who's this upstart Russian lady, you know?
Right. Yeah, right. Good point. She's a foreigner.
She's a foreigner, exactly. And Russian, you know, that's even worse.
It's funny how much of an answer how they've sparked by saying ascended masters. But of course, Elizabeth Clare Prophet comes to mind. And her whole thing was about the Book of Enoch, and Saint Germain was there, and she has the Universalist Church. And that whole thing is all ascended masters, but it's borrowed from Theosophy 100 years earlier. So it's very unusual. So many things have been, you know, I found out recently that she did all of her education in Boston. And it's so interesting how many things are popping up in Boston the more I research it. Gee, I never knew it was such a fascinating town. All right, Olivia, you're up.
Since we might have a limited time, I'm going to go for the questions I want to ask.
Yes.
And I want to ask about Oak Island.
Oak Island, isn't that interesting?
So Giovanni Delgado says Oak Island has hieroglyphs discovered buried 200 feet deep, and something about a hooked X. And
Joseph, you and I had one of the most fascinating conversations in history about Oak Island, and I didn't even scratch the surface with you. Tell me, what are you thinking about Oak Island?
I do think something was there.
Yeah.
I do think the Templar connection is very clear. The hooked X thing, I think, is, Scott Wolter has done yeoman's work on that particular steganography phenomenon, and I do think that it's a steganography phenomenon.
Yeah.
What fascinates me about Oak Island is all the people that have gone there attempting to look, even Franklin Roosevelt.
Yeah, right. FDR himself.
Yeah, FDR, what's he doing in the middle of all of this? The mind boggles when you stop and think about all of the people that have tried to find something at Oak Island. And the more I think about it, Daniel, I think our friend Walter Bosley, who's done a lot of research about what he thinks is a transfer and relocation of some sort of Templar treasure all over the country, beginning on the East Coast and then moved constantly and then eventually ending up in Southern California. I think he's on to something. I really do.
Yeah.
And I think this is the reason why people that have gone to Oak Island looking for stuff haven't found anything, because it was removed very early on. And, Roosevelt showing up in the middle of it is to me another clue. It's like the Roosevelt confirmation that Thomas Jefferson and Lewis and Clark expedition was not simply about finding a Northwest Passage. I think there was something else going on there.
Yeah. Excellent question. I think Oak Island is an incredible mystery, and I think when you get into it, you're going to find secret societies. You're going to find there's actually a whole thing in there that one of the reasons they discovered it in the first place is it was a huge UFO zone, and there were these two boys going out because they were seeing lights over it all the time.
Yeah.
So, it's an endless mystery. Olivia, next.
Terry Moran says, please ask Joseph about Tesla. And did Tesla have access to the Vatican Library?
No, I don't think that he had access to the Vatican Library. For one thing, Tesla was Eastern Orthodox. His father was an Orthodox priest, and at that time in history, particularly, there was not much love lost between the two churches. So it would have been very difficult for Tesla to get any sort of, but he wouldn't have needed it.
Yeah.
Tesla, to me, Tesla is another bit of a mystery, because on the one hand, he's so rigidly scientific, and on the other hand, he's very mystical, because most of his inventions, alternating current and the dynamo and all of that, he had visions of these things, literally would picture them. So, there's another guy I think that's in contact somehow with.
Oh yeah,
with his higher. Yeah. He was a strange duck. There's just no two ways about it. I hope that's answering sufficiently for your.
Yes.
Well, I'm going to roll off of that into this question, which is the Vatican hiding ancient texts, and was the burning of the Library of Alexandria a false flag theft of ancient texts?
Wait. What did you say? Ancient tech or texts? Texts. Okay. I always go tech.
In answer to the question in the chat room, no, I do not belong to any secret society, and I'm not a Freemason. I have been invited to join some of those societies, but I've always declined. Library of Alexandria. I like the premise of the question, the way the question is phrased, because I have had suspicions for a long time that the Library of Alexandria burning may have been some sort of false flag op to remove a great deal of the knowledge that was there, and particularly the cartography that I think may have been there and bring it to the Imperial Archives in Constantinople, where I think a lot of it eventually ended up. I do think that there's something very fishy about the burning of the Library of Alexandria. For one thing, given the fact that this was Alexander the Great's attempt to create a copyright library, literally kind of an ancient Library of Congress, it stands to reason that they would have made copies of virtually everything in that library.
Right.
And, I've always suspected that a lot of that stuff eventually ends up, partially Damascus during the Caliphate, and then also in Constantinople, probably some of it ending up in the Persian Empire, because the Persians, of course, invaded Egypt a number of times successfully. So I think the Library of Alexandria probably was dispersed, but that a great deal of it probably survived.
Wow. Amazing. What do you got?
Lee Veltman, curious if Joseph and Daniel will discuss Tavistock and the Royal Society and the MK Ultra experiments.
Wow. We could do a whole show on that, frankly.
Yeah, we could. I'll let you start on that one.
I think it's interesting. What's attributed to Tavistock and then what they actually do, I think, is interesting, because people will say, the Beatles were a Tavistock creation. They created David Bowie and all this stuff, and it's just completely wrong. But when you go into the roots of what they're up to, they certainly have a drive to control the themes in society, and I think they're a fascinating study in themselves.
I'm going to crawl out onto the end of the twig, and I'm going to say that part of a major component of the mind control, mind manipulation techniques that MK Ultra, the CIA, Tavistock, a lot of these things did, was they penetrated the arts, and they deliberately created, please hear me now, they deliberately created a form of modern art that they have pushed on people to get them accustomed to two things. Number one, ugliness.
Yeah. Oh, yes. 100%.
Ugliness. And as a result of that ugliness, a deadening of the innate human faculty to be able to think on several levels simultaneously. You'll notice modern music is not contrapuntal. It's melody, chords, and boom, boom, boom in the background, which, has returned us to the jungle. They have deliberately pushed in classical music a kind of anti-music with Schoenberg, Alban Berg. You cannot study in the modern university without studying that crap, and I'm going to use that word for it.
Right.
They've done this as a means of changing the culture and shifting it out of that Renaissance, Hermetic, Christian, and Enlightenment humanism basis of our culture.
Well, absolutely. And they've degenerated the culture dramatically.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Think of the CIA's, kind of gently pushing Jackson Pollock. I wouldn't pay you a penny for a Jackson Pollock painting. It's not Rembrandt. Rembrandt and Pollock don't belong in the same breath. I'm sorry.
Well, they inspire a totally different frame of mind,
mm-hmm.
and a totally different culture. I mean,
yes.
It is just like all these things that came out about gangster rap, which
mm-hmm.
was they wanted to create this whole kind of flap,
yes.
of the culture at the time, and they wanted to degrade the culture using that. There's no question about it. What I think is fascinating is the real story, which is what you're talking about. So often what I hear in relation to Tavistock and stuff is this nonsense about, it's an interesting thing too, because when you look at how the CIA has invaded Hollywood, for example,
Mhm.
in shows like Homeland. It's like
Mhm.
everyone's a CIA advisor on it. Uh, when the CIA shows up, you're in trouble.
You're in trouble. Yes, exactly. Uh, you cannot write good literature or create good art or compose decent music in committee. It's
Right.
just, it doesn't happen.
Right.
It doesn't happen.
This is a spontaneous action of human creativity.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Absolutely.
Okay, so CC Jarvis asks, does Dr. Farrell know of the Order of the Black Swan in relation to secret societies and vampires, re. the Orphic Circle, and the OBS has been fighting since the mid-15th century?
I
Well,
have not heard of the Black Swan, and tonight's the first time I've heard of the Order of the Orphic Circle, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to beg off and be a dunce on that one.
yeah, and that relates a lot. It's interesting. One thing I'll say about the Orphic Circle, which will be interesting to you, Joseph, is Emma Britton, who was that theosophist that Blavatsky said, well, she's really the best trance medium ever. And I was telling you that story earlier about her being a young girl and then using her almost like a MyLab type situation or MK Ultra, where they had this whole group of young women that they were using as somnambulist trance channels to get this information. And when she's referring back to them, she says at the end of her life, writing an autobiography, I still can't say who they were because I'm still sworn by the order of that group. And she said, but she identified Bulwer Lytton and a few other people. But she called them in her own book. She mentions that she referred to them as the Orphic Circle. And it's this kind of, very strange, peculiar London occult group. And people have been trying, over the years to try to figure out exactly who was in this group and what was it all about. And one of the things that she revealed about it, it related not only to state secrets, that was one of the things they went after, but it also related to this kind of trying to conjure these beings. And so whatever they were up to, I think it relates a lot to Bulwer Lytton's literature over the years, but absolutely fascinating. Next.
Okay, Cassandra Helwig. Daniel has to explain the good side of secret societies. I honestly don't know much. What do secret societies have in common to aliens, Anunnaki, Elohim?
That's funny. Well, how would you say that, Joseph? Secret societies are neither good nor bad, right?
Yeah, I view secret societies as a technology.
Yes.
They can be good or they can be bad. I think you have clearly in history examples of secret societies. Think of Cosimo de' Medici, who's clearly part of something secret, and he's doing a lot of good. You have certainly bad ones. Bavarian Illuminati would be right up there in my list of really bad organizations. But I don't view them as necessarily anything in and of themselves as bad. For the most part, most Freemasons that I know are really not out to overthrow the government or institute communist revolution or that sort of nonsense.
Right.
But what bothers me is when you become a member of a secret society, there's inevitably the temptation, just because of the secrecy, to assume superior airs to the broad mass of humanity, and that's what bothers me about them. The temptations that they pose, I think, are too much for most people to handle. That's why I stay away from them. I'm not a joiner.
Right.
I'm not.
I think what Steiner referred to as the clash between one group of mystery schools and the other group of mystery schools, that thing taking place in the 19th century, gives us a snapshot that it's not one group picture.
No, it isn't. I think that there are so many secret societies and they're constantly struggling with each other that it gets to be kind of a hall of mirrors type of thing.
Right. Perfect description.
Yeah,
Wow.
it doesn't really get us anywhere unless you do some really detailed, in-depth study. That said, there is a history by James Billington, the former Librarian of Congress, that's called Fire in the Minds of Men. And if you want a scholarly examination of secret societies and their revolutionary activity in Europe, that's the book to get a hold of. It's all laid out there in footnoted detail.
Wow, that sounds great. Olivia, 2 more questions. I'm around.
Okay. Jardin du Luxembourg asks, please ask Dr. Farrell if he can give us a hint about what he considers too dangerous to talk about and why.
Good question.
The hint of too dangerous to talk about goes to something I talk about a lot in my books and have talked about in my members area, that I call the topological metaphor of the medium. Because I do think that there is a way, following the suggestions of Newton, Descartes, and Leibniz, of formally specifying mathematically the ways of analogical thinking. And once that is formally specified, it will also give you a clue, an insight into the differences between apt and inept analogies. In other words, we have, as human beings, an innate understanding of when an analogy is appropriate and an innate understanding of when an analogy is forced or stretched. What we do not have thus far is a way of mathematically exhibiting the difference between those two things. If we can get to that point, then you would have the ability to create systems of conscious intention that are not reliant upon grimoires or books of ritual magic or things like that. You would have the conceptual mathematical foundation for those things. If you got to that point, then you're entering very dangerous territory. I hope that helps.
Wow, fascinating. Go ahead.
I'm going to ask Joseph my question. So last, which is, Joseph, where do you think evil comes from?
Where does evil come from?
Yeah. Or the source of acts of evil in men.
I think most evil is, first of all evil, all sin is a personal choice. In other words, I don't think evil has existence as a substance or a nature. Most evil is, if you examine it carefully, a personal opposition to something natural. And that, if you look at it very carefully, that ultimately is a form of death. So I view evil as an opposition to the natural order of things. And ultimately, it's I think, going back to the story of the fall, I think it's an attempt of man to be God without God. It's an attempt to say we're running the whole show, and that gets us into the trouble that we're in.
Wow, fascinating.
Follow-up question?
Yes, you can you know what I wanted to do? Actually, I want to request a question. We have Tessa Dick in the audience, and
yes,
she's a fascinating writer, and of course, she's the ex-wife of
Philip Dick.
Yes,
I actually met Tessa.
Oh, you did?
About 3 years ago. Yep.
I wanted to invite her to ask a question while we're here at the end, and I also wanted to say hi. So many great people. We had a fantastic crowd tonight for Dr. Farrell, and I'll tell you, a cult priestess is out there. It's nice to see her out there. And we have just so many people out. So if she's there, Tessa, the floor is yours. And if you have one more from the...
Well, I mean, I think the thing everybody in the chat, everybody listening is interested in is how do we, I guess, conquer evil within ourselves and within our world? And is it possible?
Is it possible to conquer evil within ourselves and the world?
I don't think it's possible to conquer evil in ourselves completely in this life. I am a believer in the fall, and that it has had a cosmological effect. Most of our problems, if you look at our politics in the last 2 centuries, our politics has been based on the idea of the perfectibility, be it Marxism or capitalism, or as I like to call it, crony capitalism. But most of what we've been trying to do is perfect things. And, you know, the poor you shall always have with you. Evil people you shall always have with you. The solutions that are being proposed are draconian in their nature and dystopian in their results. So no, I'm not a believer in perfectibilism. And that incidentally is, again, coming straight out of the Bavarian Illuminati, this idea of the perfectibility of human society. I think
point. Yeah.
It's all a very Gnostic agenda that we've been trying to pursue. And I don't think, you know, as long as we're trying to pursue it, we're not going to have any different results. Insanity is, you know, trying to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. So,
well, that's very interesting. It is very interesting. Evil Backwards is live, and we are still live. Tessa Dick's question. Do you have it?
Tessa hasn't shown up with a question.
Yes, she did. She did.
I missed it then.
It's okay. It's all right. It's there. I'll tell you what she asked. She wanted to know, Joseph, if you felt that Orpheus was a real person in history, or is he a mythological creation?
That's a really cool question. That's a really cool question. I tend to the view that these mythological characters, Orpheus, Gilgamesh, Prometheus.
Oh yeah.
I tend to think of these people as real people that faced some sort of titanic cosmological problem, and that they have become mythologized, you know, down through history. But I do tend to think of them as real people ultimately, that were involved in something cosmic and cataclysmic. They have had stories told about them, like we tend to tell stories about Abraham Lincoln or whoever, you know, that tends to be a big figure in our recent history. I view them very much that way.
Wow, absolutely. It's almost like a William Wallace type thing where there's the actual person and the legend grows up around them, but certainly it started with the core.
Right.
Excellent question. Fantastic. It's great to have everyone here. Dr. Farrell's website is gizadestar.com. And Joseph, it's been great having you here to go over.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, amazing and great to see you. And I'm glad the flu is gone. You look great and you're back and better than ever.
It's gone, thank goodness, man.
And thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a great crowd. You asked great questions. Next week it is the X series part 8, and it's going to be very special, and I hope everyone does join us. And I do want to recommend Dr. Farrell's latest book, which is Hess and Antarctica. It's actually called Hess and the Penguins, but that's what he's talking about. And it's an incredible work. And our interview on that we've recorded, and I'm going to actually put that out later this month. Things have been incredibly crazy, but that interview on his book is fascinating. So look forward to that. And definitely go ahead and get the book. I also want to mention that Joseph did an incredible wrap up, first quarter wrap up with Catherine Austin Fitz at Solari. And that's something which I think is really, you just go into all these different angles. So absolutely fascinating. Highly recommend that. And hopefully we'll have you back here soon.
All right. Thanks for having me on, Daniel.
Have a great night.
Yep. You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. And Olivia, excellent job.
Thank you, everybody.
Nicely done. We'll see you next week for sure. What's on the menu?
I think ice cream again.
Ice cream is good. Ice cream is good.
Mint
Thank you,
chip.
everyone. Have a great night.